Something arrived on the southern coast of England in the summer of 1348, and within 18 months it had killed somewhere between a third and a half of every living person on the island. Villages that had stood for 400 years simply ceased to exist. Churches were abandoned mid-construction. Fields went unploughed for decades. Entire bloodlines ended in a single season, wiped out so completely that modern genealogists hit a wall whenever they trace English family trees back past the mid-14th century. The silence after the dying was so profound that contemporary writers described it as the end of the world, not metaphorically, not as religious flourish, but as a plain and literal statement about what they were witnessing. They genuinely believed humanity was over. You were taught it was the bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, spread by fleas on rats, carried by trade ships from the Black Sea, marching west across Europe in a straight and terrible line. You were shown maps with red arrows. You memorized the symptoms. Swollen lymph nodes in the groin and armpit, blackened extremities, fever, delirium, death within days. The story is clean. It has a pathogen, a vector, a route, and a death toll. It fits neatly into a textbook page. But here is the problem. The more carefully researchers look at what actually happened in Britain in 1348, the less that story holds together. The timing is wrong. The geography is wrong. The spread pattern is wrong. The mortality rate in some regions is so far beyond anything bubonic plague produces that even the scientists who still defend the standard model have quietly started using phrases like unprecedented virulence and anomalous transmission dynamics, which is scientific language for we don't actually understand what this was. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Let's begin at the beginning, which is not 1348. The beginning is much earlier, and it is strange in ways that the textbooks never mention. There is a document held in the British Library called the Anonymal Chronicle. It was written by a monk at St. Mary's Abbey in York, and it contains a passage that historians have argued about for generations. The monk describes the plague arriving not as a creeping sickness, moving gradually through the population, but as a sudden catastrophic event that struck whole communities simultaneously, as if something had fallen from the sky. He uses specific Latin phrasing that translates roughly as a pestilential mist or a corrupting air that preceded the deaths, arriving before the sick people arrived, settling over towns before anyone with visible symptoms had entered them. Other contemporary chroniclers use similar language. Henry Knighton, a canon at Leicester Abbey, describes a general murrain that killed livestock across vast areas of England before the human deaths began. The animals died first. The fields were already failing before anyone was coughing. That detail gets dropped from the standard narrative almost entirely because it doesn't fit. Then there's the question of how fast it moved. Bubonic plague, in its classical flea and rat transmission model, moves slowly. It requires the death of the rodent host population, which drives infected fleas to seek new hosts, which requires physical proximity, which limits how quickly the disease can travel across open countryside. Epidemiologists studying documented bubonic plague outbreaks from the 19th and 20th centuries, outbreaks we can track with much greater precision, calculate a maximum spread rate of roughly 1 to 2 miles per day under ideal conditions, often far slower. The disease tends to follow trade routes, river systems, and population clusters. It pauses at natural barriers. It stalls in winter because flea activity drops sharply in cold weather. None of that happened in Britain in 1348. The Black Death in England moved at speeds that have never been satisfactorily explained. It crossed the Pennines in winter. It jumped from Devon to Dorset and then simultaneously appeared in counties far to the north, with no documented pathway between them. It killed people in remote highland communities that had almost no contact with the trading towns where it supposedly originated. And it did all of this between late June of 1348 and the spring of 1350, an extraordinarily rapid sweep across an island that at the time had very limited internal movement infrastructure. A researcher named Susan Scott working with biologist Christopher Duncan at the University of Liverpool in the early 2000s, spent years compiling mortality data from church records, manorial rolls, and wills probate records across England and Wales. What they found was deeply uncomfortable for the mainstream model. The disease in England showed an incubation and transmission pattern that looked nothing like bubonic plague. It looked, they argued, far more like a hemorrhagic fever of the type caused by viruses, not bacteria. A viral hemorrhagic fever, spreading person to person through contact and possibly airborne droplets, would explain the speed, the winter transmission, the lack of dependence on rat populations, and critically, the mortality rate, because the mortality rate is the thing that should stop everyone cold. Bubonic plague, untreated, kills somewhere between 30 and 60% of infected individuals. That is catastrophic. But the Black Death in certain English parishes killed 80, 90, and in documented cases, 100% of the population. There are villages in the Midlands, in East Anglia, in the Yorkshire Dales, where every single person died. Every adult, every child, every elderly resident. The priest died, the gravedigger died, the lord of the manor died, the serfs died. There was no one left to bury the last victims. Modern excavations of mass graves from this period in London, in Bristol, and in rural Lincolnshire have found skeletal remains suggesting people died so fast that normal burial was simply impossible. Bodies were layered directly on top of each other in pits, sometimes dozens deep, with no soil between them. A disease killing 100% of a village cannot be bubonic plague in its classical form. The mathematics don't work. Even in worst-case scenarios, with a completely immunologically naive population, classical bubonic plague leaves survivors. The Black Death in its most intense English outbreaks did not. So what was it? Scott and Duncan proposed a viral hypothesis, and they were largely ignored by the mainstream. Their work was published, critiqued, and set aside. The DNA evidence, their critics said, settled it. In 2010, and again in 2011, German researchers extracted genetic material from teeth found in mass graves in France and Germany and identified Yersinia pestis DNA. There it was, the textbooks declared. Case closed. But it wasn't closed, because the presence of Yersinia pestis DNA in a mass grave doesn't necessarily mean Yersinia pestis was responsible for the mass grave. It means Yersinia pestis was present in the bodies. Those are not the same thing. Co-infections are common in epidemics. People dying of one disease are immunologically vulnerable to others, and the DNA extraction methodology used in those early studies has been challenged repeatedly on grounds of contamination and procedural reliability. More importantly, the DNA evidence says nothing about the transmission dynamics, the speed, the winter behavior, or the extreme mortality rates. Even if Yersinia pestis was present, it cannot account for what happened in England on its own. Something about the 1348 event was categorically different from later better documented plague outbreaks, and that difference has never been adequately explained. Now here is where it gets stranger. Much stranger. The Black Death did not begin in 1348. The medieval English were not experiencing this for the first time. There is compelling and largely suppressed historical evidence for a catastrophic pandemic hitting Britain and much of the North Atlantic world nearly 1,000 years earlier, in the 6th century, and another, less discussed wave in the early 8th century. These events are referred to in historical literature as the Plague of Justinian and its sequels, but in Britain something different seems to have happened in those early medieval waves, something that the fragmentary written sources describe in terms that sound nothing like bubonic plague. Gildas, a 6th century British monk writing in what is believed to be the 540s, describes a terrible wasting sickness moving across Britain in terms that historians have struggled to categorize. He writes of people dying suddenly, without the marks of illness having previously appeared, of entire communities collapsing over periods of weeks, of fields failing not because of human neglect, but because of something affecting the land itself. The word he uses, translated variously as plague or pestilence, is applied equally to humans, animals, and crops in a way that doesn't map cleanly onto any single known pathogen. The Annals of Ulster, compiled in Ireland from earlier sources, record a great mortality, hitting the British Isles around 544 to 549. That is described with specific language pointing to respiratory symptoms, sudden death, and environmental disruption, not swollen lymph nodes and blackened extremities. The Welsh Annals, the Annales Cambriae, record a great plague in Britain and Ireland in entries that scholars have placed in the mid-6th century, using phrasing that emphasizes communal and simultaneous death rather than sequential spread. Is this relevant to 1348? It might be more relevant than anyone has been willing to admit, because there is a hypothesis, advanced by a small group of researchers working largely outside the mainstream historical and epidemiological establishments, that Britain and the North Atlantic archipelago have been periodically subjected to catastrophic mortality events that are not straightforwardly explained by classical bacterial or viral epidemiology, and that the pattern of these events, their timing, their geographic clustering, their relationship to reported environmental anomalies, points towards something that the standard models of disease transmission don't account for. Before you dismiss that as conspiracy territory, let's look at the evidence more carefully. The year 1348 was not a normal year climatically. The preceding decade had seen some of the most severe weather disruption in recorded European history. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the European population through a combination of crop failure, livestock death, and starvation. That famine was itself preceded by a period of dramatic climate instability, including repeated harvest failures across the whole of the Northern Hemisphere that contemporary sources connect to persistent cloud cover, unseasonable cold, and corruption of the air. Modern climatologists studying ice core data and tree ring records have confirmed that the early 14th century saw a sharp and sustained drop in Northern Hemisphere temperatures associated with what is now called the Wolf solar minimum, a period of dramatically reduced solar output that lasted roughly from 1280 to 1350. A weakened, malnourished population, immunologically compromised by 2 decades of famine and nutritional deficiency, would obviously be more vulnerable to any infectious disease. That's not controversial. What is controversial is the suggestion that the climate disruption itself, the same disruption that caused the famine, may also have been responsible for conditions that either introduced or activated the pathogen responsible for the Black Death. There is a well-documented phenomenon in epidemiology called pathogen emergence, in which infectious agents that exist in reservoir populations in low virulence states are triggered into high virulence, high transmission states by environmental stress. Climate disruption affects rodent populations, insect populations, migratory bird patterns, and soil microbiome dynamics in ways that can fundamentally alter the epidemiological landscape. But more provocatively, there is a small and contested body of scientific literature suggesting that certain pathogens, including viral agents capable of causing hemorrhagic fevers, can be transported in the atmosphere itself, in aerosols, in dust, in the upper troposphere, and deposited over wide geographic areas simultaneously. The idea that epidemic disease can fall from the sky is not new. It predates germ theory. Ancient sources, Greek, Roman, Chinese, Indian, and indigenous American, all describe epidemic mortality events as things that arrive in the air, in meteors, in comets, in atmospheric events. For centuries, this was dismissed as pre-scientific superstition, but a handful of serious researchers working at the intersection of atmospheric science, astrobiology, and epidemiology have been quietly accumulating evidence that the ancients may have been describing something real. The British astronomer and mathematician Fred Hoyle, along with his colleague Chandra Wickramasinghe, spent decades arguing that viruses and other biological material travel through the cosmos embedded in cometary dust and are periodically deposited in Earth's atmosphere. Their theory, called panspermia in its broader form and cometary panspermia in its specific epidemiological application, is deeply unfashionable in mainstream science. But the evidence they compiled is harder to dismiss than the fashion would suggest. Wickramasinghe, in particular, pointed to the geographic pattern of influenza pandemic emergence in the 20th century, arguing that several major influenza outbreaks appeared simultaneously in widely separated geographic locations with no documented contact pathways, a pattern he argued was more consistent with atmospheric deposition than with person-to-person or animal-to-human transmission chains. The 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed more people worldwide than the First World War, showed a particularly anomalous emergence pattern, appearing almost simultaneously in military camps on at least 3 continents before any documented cross-continental travel that could account for the spread. Now, the mainstream scientific community has explanations for all of this. Global shipping, military troop movements, the chaos of wartime logistics. And those explanations are probably largely correct for 1918. But the question that Wickramasinghe and his colleagues were really asking was not whether 1918 flu spread person to person, because of course it did, but where it came from in the first place, and why it appeared to erupt from multiple independent origins, more or less simultaneously. That same question, applied to 1348 in Britain, opens doors that have been deliberately kept shut. The standard narrative says the Black Death entered England through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset in late June or early July of 1348, carried by sailors on ships coming from Gascony. That's the textbook origin story. But the earliest mortality records from England in 1348 don't all cluster around Dorset. There are documented deaths in multiple widely separated locations in the late summer of 1348, some of which have no plausible connection to the Dorset port entry. A researcher working through the episcopal registers of several English dioceses in the 1980s found evidence of unusual mortality in parts of Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and East Anglia before the conventional disease front from Dorset could possibly have reached those areas, given the documented spread rates. Those inconvenient data points have never been satisfactorily explained. They were noted, questioned, and then quietly absorbed into the standard narrative without any real reckoning with what they imply. The implication, which nobody has been willing to state plainly, is that the Black Death may not have entered England from a single point of origin at all. It may have appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, or near simultaneously, which is precisely what you would expect from an atmospheric deposition event and precisely what you would not expect from a disease spreading through flea-rat human transmission chains. Let's talk about the bodies for a moment, because the physical evidence from 14th century mass graves tells a story that the standard textbooks largely ignore. Between the 1980s and the 2010s, a series of major excavations of Black Death mass graves in England produced skeletal assemblages that were subjected to increasingly sophisticated analysis. The largest and most scientifically important of these was the excavation of a burial ground on the site of the East Smithfield Cemetery in London, which was established specifically for Black Death victims in 1348 and used for approximately 2 years. Over 800 individuals were recovered from this site, and the skeletal analysis produced several findings that sit very uncomfortably with the bubonic plague narrative. First, the age distribution of the dead was anomalous. Classical bubonic plague, like most infectious diseases, kills preferentially at the extremes of the age distribution, the very young and the very old, because these groups have the most compromised immune responses. The East Smithfield population showed a strikingly different pattern, with high mortality among young adults, including people who should have been at the peak of their immune competence. And that pattern is more consistent with a novel pathogen against which the population had no prior immune experience, which tells us very little about what the pathogen was, but does rule out the possibility that this was simply a recurrence of a disease the population had encountered before. Second, the skeletal evidence showed very little of the bone pathology that would be expected in a population dying of septicemic plague. Systemic bacterial infections of the severity needed to produce the mortality rates documented in 1348 leave traces in bone. They cause specific lesions, specific patterns of bone degradation that forensic paleopathologists can identify. The East Smithfield skeletons showed these markers in a minority of individuals, but not in the majority, suggesting that for many of the dead, the disease killed so fast that there was no time for the infection to affect the skeleton at all. That kind of rapid death is more consistent with a viral hemorrhagic process than with bacterial septicemia. Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, dental calculus analysis of the East Smithfield remains showed evidence of severe nutritional deficiency in the years preceding death, consistent with the famine period of the 1310s and 1320s. This matters because it suggests that the people who died in 1348 in London were not a random cross-section of the population, but were disproportionately individuals who had suffered significant immunological damage during childhood or adolescence due to famine-related malnutrition. They were, in other words, already vulnerable in ways that went beyond the immediate immune naivety of an unexposed population. What this tells us is that the Black Death in England was not a single thing. It was a catastrophic collision between a novel and apparently highly virulent pathogen and a population that had been pre-weakened by 2 decades of climate-driven famine. Remove either component and the outcome would have been different. The pathogen hitting a well-nourished population might still have been terrible but survivable. The famine alone, absent the pathogen, would have continued its slow grinding mortality without the sudden catastrophic collapse. The two together created something unprecedented, but this still doesn't tell us what the pathogen actually was. And this is where the story takes a turn that leads directly into territory that professional historians and epidemiologists are extremely reluctant to enter. There is a class of infections called hemorrhagic fevers caused by a family of RNA viruses that produce mortality rates, transmission dynamics, and symptom profiles that match the 14th century English evidence far better than Yersinia pestis does. Ebola is the most famous modern representative of this family. Marburg virus is another. Several less well-known members of this viral family have been documented in rodent reservoir populations across Eurasia and Africa. They kill fast, they kill comprehensively, they can spread through direct contact, and in some conditions, through respiratory aerosols, and they leave minimal bone pathology in victims who die quickly. The hypothesis, advanced carefully and with full acknowledgement of its speculative nature by Scott and Duncan in their 2001 book, Biology of Plagues, is that the Black Death was caused by a hemorrhagic fever virus, probably a filovirus or arenavirus, that emerged from a reservoir population in Central Asia in the mid-14th century, spread westward through a combination of direct transmission and possibly atmospheric or environmental vectors, and hit Britain at a moment when the population was maximally vulnerable due to 2 decades of famine and climatic stress. This hypothesis explains the anomalous mortality rates. It explains the winter transmission. It explains the speed of spread. It explains the simultaneous appearance at multiple geographic locations. It explains the symptom descriptions that don't perfectly match bubonic plague. And it explains why the event was so categorically different from later documented plague outbreaks in the same country. It does not, however, explain one of the most persistently strange features of the English Black Death, which is the pattern of survival. Because some people survived. In every community where the disease struck, even the communities with the highest mortality, a small number of people lived. Sometimes it was 10% of the population, sometimes it was 5%. In a few documented cases, it appears to have been 1 or 2 individuals out of a community of several hundred. Those survivors were not, as far as we can tell, disproportionately wealthy, or well-nourished, or geographically isolated, or in any obvious way, different from those who died. They lived in the same houses, ate the same food, drank the same water, they had the same exposure. They should have died. They didn't. Modern genetic research has found a partial answer to this mystery, and it is one of the most remarkable things to emerge from the study of the Black Death. There is a specific genetic mutation, a deletion in the gene, that codes for a protein called CCR5, that confers significant resistance to certain RNA viruses, including HIV. The mutation is called CCR5 delta 3, and it appears in European populations at a frequency of roughly 10 to 15%, with notable geographic clustering. It is present in higher frequencies in populations of northern and northwestern European descent, particularly in English, Irish, Scottish, Scandinavian, and North German populations, and it is essentially absent from populations in sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and the pre-Columbian Americas. Geneticists studying the frequency and distribution of CCR5 delta 32 in European populations have calculated that the mutation's current prevalence is far higher than would be expected from neutral genetic drift or from its modest protective effects against documented historical pathogens. In other words, the mutation is too common. Something drove it to high frequency, and the timing and geographic distribution of that selection pressure map remarkably well onto the Black Death and its subsequent waves in Northern and Western Europe. The implication is extraordinary. The Black Death may have killed 10 to 15% of the surviving European population, not because those individuals were luckier or better nourished, but because they carried a genetic mutation that protected them against a viral pathogen. And that mutation, which was present at low frequency in the population before 1348, was driven to high frequency by the simple fact that almost everyone without it died. This is natural selection operating in real time on a human population, brutal and efficient, eliminating genetic vulnerability at a cost measured in millions of lives. But here is the wrinkle. CCR5 delta 32 is known to confer resistance primarily to RNA viruses, specifically to viruses that use the CCR5 receptor as a cell entry point. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for classical bubonic plague, does not use CCR5 as a cell entry point. A bacterium wouldn't. Bacteria and viruses use completely different mechanisms to infect cells. So if CCR5 delta 32 was selected for by the Black Death, that is very strong indirect genetic evidence that the Black Death was, at least in part, a viral infection, not a bacterial one. The mainstream response to this argument has been to suggest that CCR5 delta 32 may have been selected for by smallpox, not by the Black Death, since smallpox is a DNA virus that does interact with the CCR5 pathway. That's possible, but the timeline doesn't fit neatly with the smallpox hypothesis, and the geographic clustering of CCR5 delta 32 in populations most severely affected by the mid-14th century pandemics is harder to explain through a smallpox selection model. This is not settled science. It is an active, contentious, unresolved debate in evolutionary genetics, epidemiology, and historical medicine. But the direction of the evidence, the accumulation of anomalies that cannot be explained by the standard model, points strongly toward the conclusion that what arrived in Britain in 1348 was more complex, more novel, and more biologically extraordinary than a flea-borne bacterial infection. Now let's talk about what people at the time actually said, because the contemporary accounts of the Black Death in England are some of the most vivid and disturbing documents in British history, and they have never been fully incorporated into the scientific debate about the disease's nature. The chronicler, Geoffrey Le Baker, writing in the 1350s, describes the onset of symptoms in a way that is worth examining in detail. He writes of a sudden and terrible burning heat in the body, followed by the appearance of pustules and carbuncles, and then in many cases a blackening of the skin, beginning at the extremities and spreading inward. He describes people dying within a day of first symptoms, sometimes within hours. He notes that those who stayed near the sick were overwhelmingly likely to die themselves, suggesting a high-efficiency transmission mode, but also notes that some individuals who had prolonged and direct contact with infected persons remained healthy. The variability in transmission efficiency is, again, more consistent with a viral model with variable host susceptibility than with a classical bacterial flea vector model. The anomaly chronicler, writing from York, adds a detail that has been largely dismissed as poetic embellishment, but which deserves more serious consideration. He writes of a fire coming before the plague, not a literal fire, but a kind of atmospheric burning, a description of heat or light in the sky that preceded the outbreak by days or weeks in each new location. He is not alone in this. Multiple 14th century European sources, from Italy, from France, from the Low Countries, describe unusual atmospheric phenomena, lights, fires, mists, corrupted air in connection with the plague's arrival. In at least 3 cases, these descriptions specifically predate the appearance of sick people in the affected location, which rules out the straightforward interpretation that people were burning bodies and the accounts were misremembering the sequence. The medieval chroniclers were not scientists. They had no germ theory, they had no understanding of viral transmission or atmospheric deposition. They described what they saw using the conceptual vocabulary available to them, which was a vocabulary of divine punishment, corrupted air, celestial omens, and supernatural causation. We should not take their theological interpretations literally, but we should take their observations seriously, because these were literate, educated, careful observers, many of them monks whose daily practice included meticulous record-keeping, and when multiple independent observers in multiple geographic locations described the same sequence of events, atmospheric anomaly followed by sudden catastrophic mortality, that is data, inconvenient data, inexplicable data within the standard framework, but data nonetheless. The question of what precisely those atmospheric phenomena were is one that no mainstream historian or epidemiologist has been willing to seriously address. But the range of possible explanations is not limited to the supernatural. Dust storms carrying microbial or viral material from disturbed reservoir areas in Central Asia or North Africa are documented atmospheric events in the medieval period. Volcanic eruptions, several of which are documented in the mid-14th century, could have disrupted normal atmospheric circulation and created unusual optical phenomena while simultaneously depositing material that affected both climate and possibly pathogen dispersal. And there are the more radical possibilities, the ones that exist only at the fringes of mainstream science, but that cannot simply be dismissed without engaging with the evidence. There is a research tradition associated primarily with the work of Wickramasinghe and his colleagues at the Cardiff Centre for Astrobiology that documents correlations between cometary or meteoritic activity and epidemic outbreaks across multiple historical periods. The correlations are statistical, not mechanistic, and the mainstream consensus is that they are coincidental. But the list of correlations is long enough, and the proposed mechanism, atmospheric deposition of biological material from cometary or interplanetary dust, is not inherently impossible. That dismissal requires more than a shrug. What we know for certain is this. The Black Death arrived in Britain in 1348, at the end of one of the most climatically and environmentally disrupted periods in medieval history. It moved faster than any documented bubonic plague outbreak. It killed at rates higher than any documented bubonic plague outbreak. It left genetic signatures in the surviving population, consistent with viral rather than bacterial selection pressure. And it was described by contemporaries in ways that include atmospheric and environmental anomalies that do not feature in the standard narrative. What we do not know is what it actually was. The DNA evidence is real and cannot be entirely dismissed, but it is not the clean resolution that the textbooks present it as. The presence of Yersinia pestis in the graves is a fact. Whether Yersinia pestis was the primary or sole agent responsible for the catastrophe is a much less certain thing. And now, because this story does not end in 1348, let's follow the thread forward, because what happened to England after the Black Death is almost as strange as the Black Death itself. The disease came back. It came back repeatedly in 1361, in 1368, in 1374, in 1382, and in further waves through the entire remainder of the 14th century and into the 15th. Each wave killed fewer people than the first, because each wave encountered a population in which the most genetically vulnerable individuals had already been eliminated, and survivors' children carried the protective mutations at higher frequency. But even the second wave in 1361 was catastrophic by any standard other than comparison with 1348. That wave is sometimes called the pestis secunda in historical sources, and it was notable for killing children preferentially, which makes biological sense if the first wave had immunized or genetically selected adult survivors, but left children, born after 1348, fully naive to the pathogen. The pattern of recurrent waves, each hitting children and young adults hardest, continuing until the late 15th century, is consistent with a novel pathogen, cycling through a partially immune population in the way that newly emergent viruses typically behave in human populations. It is less consistent with bubonic plague, which does not generate lasting immunity in survivors and should theoretically have continued killing adults and children indiscriminately in each wave. But the long-term consequences of the Black Death in England go beyond epidemiology, and they include social, economic, and even psychological transformations that were so profound and so strange that they effectively created a different country than the one that had existed before 1348. The labour scarcity created by mass death fundamentally altered the economic relationship between lords and peasants. When half the workforce is dead, the survivors have enormous bargaining power. Wages rose dramatically. Serfs who survived demanded and received better conditions. The entire feudal system, which had been based on an assumption of surplus labour and peasant powerlessness, cracked. Not immediately, not without violence, not without the ruling classes attempting to legislate the situation back to pre-plague conditions through laws like the Statute of Labourers of 1351, which attempted to cap wages at pre-plague levels and was almost universally ignored. But the economic logic of serfdom was broken by the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which English peasants rose against their lords in the most significant popular uprising in medieval English history, was a direct consequence of that broken logic. The church was also devastated in ways that went beyond the loss of clergy to the disease itself. The church had, for over a century before 1348, been the primary institutional repository of learning, of medicine, of social organization, and of ideological legitimacy. When half the priests died, including experienced and educated senior clergy, and were replaced in desperate haste by undertrained replacements, the quality and authority of the church declined sharply. More fundamentally, the church had been telling people for generations that a life of piety and obedience would earn divine protection. The Black Death did not appear to have received that message. Priests died, abbots died, bishops died, the pious and the sinful died in equal measure. The survivors noticed. This was not an immediate crisis of faith. The immediate psychological response to catastrophic plague in medieval England was, if anything, an intensification of religious practice, a desperate escalation of prayer, pilgrimage, and penitential behavior in the hope that sufficient devotion might yet earn divine mercy. The flagellant movement, groups of believers who publicly whipped themselves in ritualistic penitence, was a continental phenomenon that had limited expression in England but speaks to the psychological extremity of the moment. But the longer-term effect, the gradual generational erosion of absolute institutional religious authority, the increasing willingness of ordinary people to ask uncomfortable questions about why God had allowed this to happen, is visible in the religious and intellectual history of the late 14th and 15th centuries in ways that feed directly into the conditions that made the Protestant Reformation possible a century and a half later. John Wycliffe, the Oxford theologian who is regarded as the primary intellectual forefather of English Protestantism, began his most radical phase of activity in the 1370s, less than 30 years after the Black Death. His arguments that the Church had forfeited its spiritual authority through corruption and worldliness, that the Bible should be available in English rather than Latin, and that individual believers should have direct access to Scripture without institutional mediation, were not responses to the Black Death in any simple causal sense. But they were responses to a world in which the Church's claims to divine authority and special knowledge had been tested against catastrophic reality and found wanting. The Black Death also transformed English landscape and settlement patterns in ways that are visible to this day. The phenomenon of deserted medieval villages, of which over 3,000 examples have been documented in England alone, is partly a Black Death consequence. Villages that lost too many people to maintain viable agricultural communities were simply abandoned. The fields were subsumed into pasture. The buildings deteriorated. Within a generation, in some cases, all surface trace of a community that had existed for hundreds of years was gone. Some of these villages were never repopulated. Their earthwork remains. The faint ridge and furrow patterns of their field systems, the mounds of their building platforms, the dip of their village ponds are still visible from the air across much of Midland England, ghostly impressions of a world that ended in 1348 and was never rebuilt. The psychological impact, which is harder to quantify than demographic or economic change, was profound and lasting. 14th century English literature and art show a preoccupation with death, with the arbitrariness of survival, with the proximity of mortality that has no real parallel in the centuries immediately before 1348. The danse macabre tradition, the artistic motif of death as a skeleton or decomposing figure, leading people of all ranks and ages in an inevitable dance toward the grave, emerged in the decades after the Black Death and became one of the dominant artistic expressions of the late medieval period. The emphasis on equality in death, on the leveling power of mortality that respected no social rank, the knight and the merchant and the peasant all following the same grim dancer, reflects the lived experience of a generation that had watched the highest and lowest in society die with equal randomness. William Langland's Piers Plowman, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and the anonymous Pearl poem, three of the greatest works of English medieval literature, were all written in the second half of the 14th century by authors who had grown up in a world shaped entirely by the Black Death and its aftermath. The social complexity, the skepticism about authority, the interest in ordinary people's lives and voices, rather than just the lives of the aristocracy and the saints, the willingness to examine death and suffering directly rather than through the distancing lens of theological allegory, all of these qualities that make these works feel surprisingly modern are qualities formed by the specific psychological and social conditions of post-plague England. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this. The event that destroyed half of England also, in a very real sense, created English literature as we know it. Now let's take a step back and ask the question that the mainstream narrative almost never asks. Why specifically Britain? The Black Death killed throughout Europe. We know this. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, all experienced catastrophic mortality in the 1348 to 1350 period. The total European death toll is estimated at somewhere between 30 and 60% of the pre-plague population, so Britain was not uniquely targeted, but the English mortality pattern, specifically in some regions, appears to have been higher than the average European experience, and the geographic distribution within England was highly uneven in ways that are difficult to explain through simple disease transmission models. Some areas, particularly in the rural Midlands and parts of East Anglia, appear to have suffered mortality rates approaching or exceeding 60 to 70% of the local population. Other areas, including some coastal communities and some highland zones, appear to have been significantly less affected. The patchwork pattern of mortality is not consistent with a disease spreading uniformly through a population from a single entry point. It is consistent with a disease whose transmission was influenced by local environmental factors, by geography, by soil type, by water sources, by prevailing wind patterns, by factors that have nothing to do with the standard flea-rat-human transmission chain. There are researchers who have noted correlations between the areas of highest 14th century English mortality and specific geological and hydrological features. Areas with particular types of peat soil, areas with specific patterns of standing water, areas with known rodent population dynamics that differ from surrounding regions. These correlations are preliminary and contested, but they suggest that the local geography of the Black Death in England was more complex and more environmentally determined than the standard narrative acknowledges. There is also the matter of the ecclesiastical records, which are the primary source for mortality data in medieval England, because they record the appointment of replacement clergy whenever incumbents died. These records show a striking geographic clustering of extreme mortality in specific dioceses, and when those dioceses are mapped against landscape and environmental data, some patterns emerge that are genuinely difficult to explain through person-to-person transmission dynamics. The Diocese of York, in the north of England, shows mortality rates among its clergy between 1348 and 1350 that are among the highest recorded anywhere in England. The Diocese of Norwich in East Anglia shows similarly extreme rates. Both of these regions are characterized by specific landscape types, extensive wetland and fenland environments in the case of East Anglia, and the specific upland valley geography of Yorkshire that would have supported large rodent populations of the type that serve as reservoirs for hemorrhagic fever viruses in documented modern outbreaks. Whether that coincidence is explanatory or merely coincidental is a question that nobody has yet answered definitively. Let's now look at what the genetic archaeology tells us, because this is the area where the most dramatic new evidence has emerged in the last decade. Ancient DNA analysis has become extraordinarily powerful in the 21st century, allowing researchers to extract and sequence genetic material from bone and teeth thousands of years old with increasing reliability. Applied to the Black Death, this technology has produced two kinds of results: one that supports the mainstream narrative, and one that fundamentally challenges it. The supporting result is the identification of Yersinia pestis genetic sequences in multiple Black Death mass graves across Europe, including the East Smithfield Cemetery in London. This is the result that the textbooks emphasize. Case closed, the bug was identified. The challenging result is the analysis of the genomes of the human individuals in those graves, specifically the frequency of immune-related genetic variants, including CCR5 delta 32 in pre-plague, plague period, and post-plague populations. The most comprehensive study of this type, published in 2022 by a large international research consortium, analyzed ancient genomes from over 2,000 individuals spanning the period from the 13th through the 16th centuries, and found a statistically significant increase in the frequency of CCR5 delta 32 in post-plague populations compared to pre-plague populations in Northern and Western Europe. The study's authors interpreted this finding conservatively, noting the CCR5 delta 32 result without drawing strong conclusions about what pathogen had selected for it, and noting that the mechanism by which the deletion might confer protection against Yersinia pestis was unclear. But other researchers, reading the same data, drew a more direct conclusion. The selection signature is too strong and too specifically shaped to be explained by Yersinia pestis alone. Something in the Black Death was viral, and it was that viral component that drove the selection for CCR5 delta 32, and that viral component has never been isolated, identified, or named. This is the real hidden history of 1348. Not a conspiracy, not a suppression, just the quiet, uncomfortable accumulation of evidence that doesn't fit the story we've been telling, sitting in academic journals and specialist monographs and contested research papers, largely invisible to the general public, rarely acknowledged in the popular histories, that tell you it was rats and fleas and a bacterium named in the late 19th century. The full picture, as best as it can be assembled from the available evidence, looks something like this. In the middle of the 14th century, a period of unprecedented climatic and environmental stress in the Northern Hemisphere, one or more novel pathogens emerged in Central Asia, possibly from disturbed reservoir populations in the eastern steppes, possibly through mechanisms that included atmospheric or environmental vectors that are not yet fully understood. These pathogens spread westward through a combination of human movement and possibly other transmission routes. When they hit the population of Britain, they encountered a people already devastated by 2 decades of famine-driven malnutrition and immunological depletion, living in a specific set of environmental conditions that may have made transmission particularly efficient. The result was a mortality catastrophe of a magnitude and speed that cannot be fully accounted for by classical plague epidemiology. It killed between a third and a half of the population. It left genetic signatures consistent with viral selection pressure. It created conditions that transformed English society, economics, religion, and culture in ways that echoed forward for centuries. And then it was labeled, categorized, explained, and boxed away as a simple bacterial infection, spread by fleas on rats. Because that explanation, while incomplete and probably incorrect in important respects, is tidy enough to fit in a textbook. The people who died in 1348 deserve better than a tidy explanation. They deserve the messy, contested, genuinely uncertain truth, which is that something extraordinary happened, something that we still do not fully understand, something that bent the arc of British history more sharply than almost any other single event in the island's long story. Now, because no investigation of the Black Death in Britain can be complete without it, let's spend some time with the survivors. Not statistically, individually, because the testimony of survival in this period is extraordinary, and it reveals things about the human response to catastrophic mortality that the epidemiological data alone cannot capture. Ralph of Shrewsbury, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, wrote a letter to the clergy of his diocese in August 1348 as the plague was arriving in the southwest of England. That is one of the most remarkable documents of the entire medieval period. He writes with absolute candor that the situation he is dealing with is beyond anything in the experience of the Church, that priests are dying faster than they can be replaced, that many communities are left without any ordained clergy to administer the sacraments, and therefore, in one of the most radical dispensations in the history of English Catholicism, he grants permission for lay people to hear confession from those who are dying if no priest is available. He extends this permission even to women, which in any normal ecclesiastical context would have been completely unthinkable. The willingness of a senior bishop, a man whose entire identity and authority rested on the hierarchical structure of the Church, to authorize women to perform a priestly sacramental function, is a measure of how extreme the situation was. It is the 14th century equivalent of an emergency order, suspending all normal institutional rules. The world had stopped working, and the Bishop of Bath and Wells was improvising in real time, trying to ensure that the dying at least had some form of spiritual care, even if the institutional structures had collapsed around them. Henry Knighton of Leicester, whose chronicle is one of the most detailed English accounts of the plague, writes about the economic aftermath with a specificity that brings the social catastrophe into sharp focus. He records that animals wandered freely because their owners were dead, that livestock died in the fields because there was no one to tend them, that crops rotted unharvested because the harvest workers were gone, that whole villages stood empty with houses open and no one living in them. He writes of the sudden and dramatic rise in wages for labourers and craftspeople with visible astonishment and disapproval, clearly understanding that the social order he had known all his life was being overturned by the simple mathematics of death. But what strikes me most about Knighton's chronicle is a passage in which he writes about a tournament held in 1348, as the plague was beginning to spread, in which the participants wore masks and extravagant costumes and held elaborate celebrations apparently intended to deny or defy the mortality closing in around them. This is a specific, datable, named event, not a general description, and it is one of the earliest documented examples in English history of the specific psychological phenomenon of festive denial in the face of epidemic catastrophe, the compulsion to hold parties, to maintain normal social rituals, to insist on the continuity of life even as death arrives. It recurs in the historical record of every major epidemic. It recurred in the early stages of the 2020 pandemic. Whatever it is deeply human, and it was as present in 1348 as in any subsequent century. The plague of 1348 also generated one of the most significant migrations in English history, not a movement of fleeing survivors, though that happened too, but a movement of the clergy, specifically the movement of replacement clergy into parishes left vacant by the death of their priests. These replacements were frequently young, undertrained, barely literate in Latin, drawn from social classes that had never previously had access to the priesthood, hurriedly ordained through accelerated processes that bypassed normal training requirements, because the Church needed warm bodies in parishes where the previous incumbent had died and there was no time for the normal decade-long route to ordination. The resulting expansion of access to the clerical life, and through the clerical life to literacy, to Latin, to the wider intellectual world, to the possibility of advancement through learning rather than birth, was one of the unintended social consequences of the Black Death that had long-term effects on the intellectual and cultural history of England. Some of the most significant English thinkers of the late 14th and early 15th centuries came from precisely these backgrounds. They were the beneficiaries of a system opened up by mass death, men who would never have had access to education or intellectual life under normal conditions, who entered the clergy because the plague had created vacancies that normal social hierarchy would have kept closed, and who then used that access to produce some of the most important writing in English history. The cultural flowering of the late 14th century, the emergence of the English literary tradition as a serious intellectual force rather than a secondary cousin of continental French and Latin culture, is in this very specific sense a consequence of the Black Death. Which brings us to an aspect of this history that is almost never discussed: the genetics of the English post-plague population, not just the CCR5 Delta 32 story, but the broader genetic legacy of a 50% mortality event in a national population. When half the people in a country die over an 18-month period, and when their deaths are not randomly distributed, but are correlated with specific genetic vulnerabilities, the genetic profile of the surviving population is fundamentally altered. The children born in England after 1348 were the children of a selected population. They inherited not just the material circumstances of a post-plague world, but the genetic legacy of selection pressure, so intense and so rapid that its traces are still visible in the modern English genome. Modern population geneticists studying the genetic structure of the English population have found multiple lines of evidence for a significant population bottleneck in the mid-14th century, consistent with the known demographic impact of the Black Death. Bottleneck events leave specific signatures in population genetics, reductions in genetic diversity, increases in the frequency of variants that were present in the surviving population, and occasionally the fixation of previously rare alleles that happened by chance to be overrepresented in the survivors. The English genetic bottleneck of 1348 is visible in these data, though it sits on top of earlier bottlenecks and migration events that complicate its interpretation. But the more interesting story is what the bottleneck tells us about the survivors themselves. If the disease preferentially killed individuals without CCR5 Delta 32 and with other immune-related genetic variants that reduced their ability to respond to the specific pathogens involved in 1348, then the survivors were not a random sample of the pre-plague population. They were people whose immune systems happened, through genetic fortune, to be equipped to deal with this particular challenge. Their descendants, the modern English population, carry that immune legacy. There is a speculative but not entirely unfounded argument, made by several immunologists over the years, that the specifically high frequency of CCR5 Delta 32 in Northern and Western European populations, and the relative absence of this mutation in populations with no exposure to the 14th century pandemic, may partly explain differential susceptibility to certain modern infectious diseases, including HIV, in different global populations. HIV uses the CCR5 receptor for cell entry, and individuals homozygous for CCR5 Delta 32, those who inherited the mutation from both parents, show very high resistance to HIV infection. Individuals heterozygous for the mutation show slower disease progression. This is not a comfortable line of reasoning because it touches on questions of differential disease susceptibility between populations, which is a topic with a very ugly historical legacy. But the biological facts are what they are. The Black Death may have inadvertently created a modest genetic protection in the descendants of its Northern European survivors against a virus that would not be identified for 6 centuries. That is not a happy story. It is a story about the extraordinary, unconscious cruelty of evolutionary processes, about how protection for some can come from the deaths of others, about the strange and terrible way that catastrophe shapes populations across centuries. Now let's turn to the question of what the authorities knew and what they did. Because the institutional response to the Black Death in England is a study in the limitations of power in the face of incomprehensible catastrophe. King Edward III was one of the most capable English monarchs of the medieval period. He had won the Battle of Crecy in 1346 in a victory so dramatic it had essentially rewritten European military thinking. His administration was sophisticated by medieval standards, with functioning bureaucratic systems for taxation, justice, and military organization that represented the accumulated institutional learning of generations. When the Black Death arrived, he tried to govern through it, and largely failed. The Parliament scheduled for January 1349 was postponed because too many members were dead or dying to constitute a quorum. The administrative machinery of royal government ground to a near halt as clerks, officials, and administrators died faster than they could be replaced. The taxation records, the legal proceedings, the land registry functions that had maintained the administrative fabric of the kingdom were disrupted so severely that entire categories of royal record from 1348 to 1350 simply do not exist, because the people who would have kept those records were dead. Edward himself survived the plague, along with most of his immediate family, though not all. His daughter Joan died of the plague in Bordeaux in September 1348, while travelling to Spain for her marriage to the heir to the Castilian throne, a death that was personally devastating to the king and which he described in a letter to the King of Castile in terms of almost unbearable grief. The letter survives and is one of the most moving royal documents in English medieval history, a king stripped of formal language by the rawness of paternal loss, writing with what feels like genuine human anguish about the daughter he will never see again. The institutional response that the authorities could manage was largely religious. Processions, masses, prayers, intercessions to specific saints with supposed plague protection properties, particularly Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, though the latter's particular association with plague came later in the medieval period. The secular authorities had no public health framework, no quarantine infrastructure, no understanding of transmission mechanisms. They could not have done much that they did not do, given the knowledge available to them. There were a few exceptions. Venice had already by 1348 begun developing what would become the world's first systematic quarantine protocols, requiring ships to anchor offshore for 30 days before their crews could land. This was not yet quarantine in the 40-day sense that the word later implied, but it was the beginning of an institutional response based on the observation that diseases spread through human movement. England developed nothing comparable for at least another century, and the absence of any port quarantine measures in 1348 and 1349 is part of why the disease was able to enter and spread so rapidly. The medical profession, such as it was in 14th century England, was completely overwhelmed and largely helpless. The dominant medical theory of the era was based on Galenic humoral theory, which understood disease as an imbalance of the four bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and recommended treatments including bloodletting, purging, and adjustment of diet to restore balance. None of this had any effect on plague. Physicians who attempted to treat plague patients died at the same rate as everyone else, a fact that was noted by contemporaries and contributed to a generalized loss of confidence in formal medicine that was one of the less visible but quite significant cultural consequences of the Black Death. Some physicians attempted empirical observation, cataloguing symptoms and outcomes in ways that foreshadowed the evidential approach of later scientific medicine. The most remarkable of these is Guy de Chauliac, a French physician who survived the Avignon plague of 1348 and wrote a detailed account of his observations, noting specifically that the disease seemed to come in two distinct forms, one characterized primarily by swollen lymph nodes and one characterized primarily by pulmonary symptoms with blood spitting, and that the pulmonary form killed faster and appeared more communicable. This two-form observation is consistent with modern understanding of how Yersinia pestis presents clinically, and it is also consistent with the possibility of a co-infecting viral pathogen, since hemorrhagic fever viruses can produce pulmonary symptoms alongside or instead of the classic cutaneous manifestations. De Chauliac's observation that the pulmonary form was more communicable is particularly interesting because it suggests that even in 1348, trained observers were noticing that some version of the disease was spreading efficiently through the air rather than through the contact mechanism implied by the flea rat model. He does not, of course, describe this in terms of airborne viral transmission, because that concept did not exist, but he describes what he sees with clinical precision, and what he sees is a disease that some people can catch simply by being near the sick, without any apparent flea bite or contact with animals. The abandonment of towns and villages by those with the means to flee is documented across England, though the effectiveness of flight was variable. Contemporary accounts note with bitter irony that flight often did not help, that the plague found the fleeing as surely as it found those who stayed, sometimes more quickly, because movement brought people into contact with new infected populations. The social logic of community was destroyed by this. In a world where your survival depends on your community, the impulse to abandon the community when it became dangerous was simultaneously rational at the individual level and catastrophic at the collective level. The people who fled left behind the old and the sick and the poor, who died faster without community support. The people who stayed died caring for others. There was no good choice, and the moral agony of those choices is recorded in the chronicles with a raw honesty that is still painful to read 7 centuries later. Let's talk now about one of the most extraordinary and least known aspects of the Black Death's English legacy, its linguistic impact. The English language in 1348 was in a state of profound instability. The Norman conquest of 1066 had imposed French as the language of power and literacy, and for nearly 3 centuries, the English ruling classes had spoken French, conducted their legal proceedings in French, written their literature in French, and regarded English as the language of peasants and the uneducated. By 1348, this diglossic situation was slowly changing, with English beginning to reassert itself in certain literary and legal contexts. But the transition was incomplete and contested. The Black Death accelerated it dramatically. With the deaths of so many French-speaking clergy and administrators, and the rapid replacement of the educated class by people from lower social strata who spoke primarily English, the practical case for conducting public life in French collapsed. Parliament began keeping records in English in the years after the plague. The courts of common law began using English. Schools that had taught in Latin and French increasingly used English as the medium of instruction, not from any ideological commitment to vernacular language, but from the simple practical reality that the teachers who knew Latin and French were dead and their replacements didn't. The English that emerged from the 14th century, the language of Chaucer and Langland, is recognizably the ancestor of the English you are reading now in a way that the pre-1348 language is not. The grammatical simplifications, the massive incorporation of French vocabulary into an English grammatical structure, the regularization of spelling conventions, the development of a London-based prestige dialect as a de facto standard, all of these processes were underway before 1348. But the Black Death compressed and accelerated them in ways that made the mid-14th century a genuine turning point in the history of the language. You are, in a very real sense, reading and speaking a language whose modern form was partly shaped by a pandemic in 1348. The words you use, the grammar you follow, the way English became a world language capable of carrying the weight of literature and law and science and commerce, all of this has its roots in processes that were fundamentally altered by the specific catastrophic demography of the Black Death. There is something vertiginous about that. The death of half the English population in the 14th century gave us Shakespeare. Not directly, not through any simple causal chain, but through the series of social and cultural transformations that the Black Death set in motion, transformations that produced the conditions in which the English language could become what it became, and English literature could produce what it produced. The dead of 1348 did not know they were shaping the future. They were just dying, in agony, in confusion, in terror, without understanding what was happening to them or why. But their deaths mattered, and their legacy is not only the tragedy of loss, it is also, impossibly and paradoxically, the culture and language and literature that we inherit. Now let's follow the thread into the century after the Black Death, because the later 14th and 15th centuries in England are a period that is almost as strange and as poorly understood as the plague itself, and the strangeness connects directly to the events of 1348 in ways that are rarely made explicit. The English peasantry of the late 14th century was a transformed social body. The survivors and their children had grown up in a world of depopulation, of abandoned villages, of labour scarcity and rising wages, of a church that had shown its institutional fallibility of a social order that had been visibly disrupted by the arbitrary democracy of mass death. They were not, as the ruling classes would have preferred, docile and grateful for their survival. They were increasingly assertive, increasingly aware of their own economic leverage, increasingly unwilling to accept the conditions of servitude that their grandparents had accepted. The Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages and working conditions at pre-plague levels by legal compulsion. It was massively resented, frequently evaded, and represented by the peasantry as exactly what it was: a ruling class attempt to use law to reverse the economic consequences of a catastrophe that the ruling classes had not suffered equally. The rich had fled to their estates. Many had survived in higher proportions than the poor, at least in some regions, partly because their better nutrition gave them marginally better immune responses, partly because their physical distance from the dense and infected living conditions of village life provided some protection. The poor had stayed and died, and now found that their survival was being used against them by laws that forced them to work for the wages of the dead. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the direct and inevitable consequence. Led by Wat Tyler in Kent and by figures including John Ball, a radical priest who preached a social gospel of radical equality, the revolt brought tens of thousands of peasants to London, occupied the Tower of London, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer, and briefly seemed to have shaken the entire social order of medieval England to its foundations. Young King Richard II, just 14 years old, met the rebels at Smithfield, the same area of London where Black Death victims had been buried in mass graves a generation earlier, promised their demands would be met, and then had Tyler killed and the revolt suppressed by military force. But the revolt, though defeated, was not without consequence. Many of the legal requirements of villeinage, the specific conditions of agricultural serfdom, were quietly abandoned in the decades after 1381, not because the ruling classes had been persuaded of their injustice, but because enforcing them against an increasingly restive and economically empowered peasantry was practically impossible. The Black Death had destroyed the economic foundations of feudal serfdom, and no amount of legal compulsion could rebuild them. There is a direct line from the mass graves of 1348, through the economic disruption of the labour shortage, through the ideological challenge of survival theology, through the social tensions of the Statute of Labourers, through the radical preaching of John Ball, to the peasants standing in Smithfield in 1381. The Black Death did not cause the peasants' revolt in any simple mechanistic sense. But the world that made the revolt possible, the world in which peasants had the confidence and the economic leverage to challenge their lords in open revolt, was a world made by the plague, and the world made by the plague was also the world that produced a particular religious sensibility in England that would, a century and a half later, make the English Reformation not just possible, but inevitable. The questioning of authority, the erosion of confidence in institutional claims to divine legitimacy, the emphasis on individual conscience and personal relationship with God, the suspicion of elaborate ritual and clerical mediation, all of these theological tendencies that characterize English Protestantism have roots that run deep into the post-plague 14th century. John Wycliffe's arguments in the 1370s and 1380s were not produced in a vacuum. They were produced in a specific intellectual and spiritual climate, a climate shaped by the experience of a generation that had asked why God had allowed the plague to kill the good and the evil, the priest and the sinner, the devout and the irreligious, with equal randomness. The theodicy problem, the problem of reconciling divine goodness with the existence of catastrophic and apparently arbitrary suffering, was not invented by the Black Death. But the Black Death made it unavoidable in a way it had not been before. You could theoretically accept the death of individuals as part of divine plan. You could not so easily accept the death of half the population of an entire Christian kingdom over 18 months as anything other than a challenge to the most basic assumptions of medieval theology. Wycliffe's answer, broadly, was that institutional Christianity had become so corrupt that God had withdrawn his protection from it, that the true church was not the institutional hierarchy, but the invisible community of the genuinely faithful, and that each individual believer had a direct relationship with God that did not require clerical mediation. These ideas, which seem relatively mild by the standards of what Protestant reformers would later argue, were sufficiently radical in their 14th century context to get Wycliffe condemned as a heretic, though he died before the condemnation could be enforced. His followers, the Lollards, continued his tradition through the 15th century, maintaining underground networks of lay religious practice that kept the questioning tradition alive until it could connect, in the 16th century, with the Continental Reformation and become the English Protestant movement. The underground Lollard networks of the 15th century are one of the most understudied aspects of English religious history. They existed primarily in the Midlands and East Anglia, precisely those regions that had suffered the highest plague mortality in 1348, and their social profile, predominantly artisans and skilled workers rather than gentry or clergy, reflects the changed social landscape of the post-plague world, in which the traditional social anchors of feudal hierarchy and unquestioning clerical authority had been loosened by the democratic catastrophe of mass death. To trace the Black Death's consequences fully would require a history of England from the 14th century to the present, because there is almost no aspect of English culture, society, economy, or religion that was not fundamentally shaped by what happened in 1348. But let me focus on one final thread before we close, because it is perhaps the strangest and most provocative of all. The Black Death in 1348 was not the last time England experienced a catastrophic epidemic with anomalous characteristics. In 1485, a disease known only as the English sweating sickness appeared without warning and killed thousands of people in weeks. It struck primarily the English, barely affecting the Welsh and Scottish populations, and apparently having almost no impact on continental Europeans, despite the documented presence of English travellers on the continent during outbreaks. It killed fast, sometimes within hours of first symptoms. It killed wealthy adults preferentially, in a reversal of the normal age and social patterns of infectious disease. It appeared 5 times between 1485 and 1551, then vanished completely and has never been seen again. The sweating sickness has never been identified. Despite being documented in meticulous clinical detail by contemporary physicians, its causative agent remains unknown. It is sometimes attributed to a hantavirus, a class of RNA viruses carried by rodents and transmitted through contact with infected animal materials, or potentially through aerosols. Some researchers have proposed an influenza-like virus. Others have suggested environmental causes, exposure to specific toxins or molds under specific meteorological conditions. Nobody knows. But the sweating sickness's ethnic and geographic selectivity, its restriction to English people in England and to English travellers abroad, its preferential targeting of well-nourished adults, its sudden appearance and equally sudden permanent disappearance, all of these characteristics echo the anomalous features of the 1348 outbreak in unsettling ways. They suggest that whatever made England susceptible to catastrophic novel epidemics in the mid-14th century had not entirely resolved itself by the late 15th century. Or they suggest that England's post-plague genetic landscape, specifically its elevated frequency of CCR5 delta 32 and whatever other immune variants had been selected for by the plague, created a specific immunological profile that was paradoxically vulnerable to a different class of novel pathogens. This is speculation. I want to be clear about that. The sweating sickness is a genuine mystery, and the connection to the Black Death is suggestive rather than demonstrable. But the existence of not one, but 2 major catastrophic English epidemic events with anomalous characteristics in the space of 137 years, both of unknown or disputed etiology, both showing transmission and mortality patterns that don't fit standard models, is a pattern that deserves more attention than it gets. There are, finally, the deep questions that the Black Death raises about the nature of civilization itself, about what human societies actually are and how they respond to existential threat. That feel particularly relevant to ask right now. The 14th century, before the plague arrived, was a world of remarkable cultural and intellectual vitality in England. The Gothic cathedrals were being completed. The great university foundations were being established. English literature was beginning to find its voice. Trade networks linked England to the wider European economy in ways that were creating new wealth and new social possibilities. It was, in the historical cliché, the High Middle Ages, the period of medieval optimism and creativity before the disasters of the late medieval period. And then in 18 months, half the people were dead. The survivors picked up and went on. Not immediately, not without profound psychological and social disruption, but eventually. They rebuilt the church even though the church had failed them. They maintained the social order even though the social order had been revealed as fragile and arbitrary. They planted crops in the fields of their dead neighbors. They married the widows and widowers of the plague years. They had children, and those children had children, and within 2 generations, the population began to recover. Slowly, unevenly, with setbacks, but recovering. What allowed them to do this is the same thing that allowed human beings to survive the other catastrophes this history is full of: the bottleneck event 900,000 years ago, the ice ages, the famines, the other pandemics. It is not resilience in the self-help sense, not a positive mental attitude or a capacity for rapid emotional recovery. It is something more fundamental and more structural. It is the human social bond, the intrinsic orientation toward other people, the need to care for and be cared for, the inability, even in extreme conditions, to entirely stop being human, to stop telling stories to each other, to stop trying to make sense of what is happening, to stop building things and making art and raising children and arguing about theology and planting crops and doing all the irreducibly human things that make up a life. The survivors of 1348 did all of these things. They wrote chronicles, they painted pictures, they built buildings, they preached sermons, they collected taxes and kept records and argued about wages and staged revolts and wrote poems that are still read and studied and taught 7 centuries later. They were traumatized and diminished and grieving and confused, and they were fully, irrepressibly, magnificently human. The Black Death is sometimes described as a catastrophe that ended the Middle Ages, that marks a sharp break between the medieval and the early modern world. There's some truth in this, but it's an oversimplification. What the Black Death actually did was accelerate processes that were already underway, compress centuries of social, economic, and religious transformation into a single brutal generation, and create conditions in which the world that emerged was recognizably different from the world that had existed before. It is tempting to see 1348 as purely a story of loss, and it is, enormously and genuinely, a story of loss. The dead deserve to be mourned. The communities that ceased to exist deserve to be remembered. The lives cut short, the children who never grew up, the old people who died before they could pass on their knowledge, the grief of the survivors. All of this is real, and it matters, and it should not be reduced to historical analysis. But the story of 1348 in England is also, ultimately, a story about what endures. The language endures, the literature endures, the genetic legacy endures, the social changes that the Black Death set in motion, the erosion of feudal serfdom, the democratization of literacy, the questioning of institutional authority, the emergence of a more individualistic religious sensibility. These endure in the structures of the modern world in ways that are invisible, precisely because they are so pervasive and so foundational. We are the descendants of the survivors of 1348, genetically, culturally, linguistically, institutionally. The world we live in is shaped by a catastrophe that happened 7 centuries ago, shaped in ways we can trace and in ways we probably cannot yet see. The half of England that died in 1348 left behind the half that lived, and the half that lived left behind us. What arrived in Britain in 1348 was not simply what they taught you. It was something more complex, more mysterious, more biologically extraordinary than a textbook entry about fleas and rats. It was something that selected for specific genetic variants that are present in your body right now. It was something that reshaped a language you speak. It was something that set in motion social and religious transformations whose consequences include the country and culture and tradition you inherit. It was something that contemporary observers described in terms of atmospheric phenomena and sudden simultaneous mortality that the standard model cannot fully explain. What it actually was remains, in the most honest and rigorous scientific sense, an open question. The DNA is in the grave records. The genetics are in the population data. The chronicle accounts are in the libraries. The anomalies are in the epidemiological models. All of it is there, waiting for someone willing to look at it without the comfortable certainty of a closed case. The dead of 1348 left us their bones, their genes, their chronicles, their buildings, their art, their language. They left us everything they had. The least we can do is keep asking the questions their deaths demand. If you've been watching this to fall asleep and you've made it this far, you know there's more here than just plague history. There's the whole strange shape of what it means for an event to be over, and yet never quite over, for a catastrophe to be in the past, and yet still running through everything we are. Subscribe if you'd like to spend more nights in these deep corners of history, in the stories that didn't fit the textbooks, the questions that stayed open, the evidence that sat in the archives waiting for someone to take it seriously. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from, what the time is, what the weather is like outside your window. Someone is always listening from somewhere I've never imagined, and that connection across time zones and centuries, and the long dark of a good strange story, is exactly what this is for. Now let's go deeper into something that the standard histories of the Black Death almost universally avoid, the question of what was already wrong in England before 1348. Not just in terms of the famine and the climate, but in terms of the deep structural vulnerabilities that made the country so extraordinarily susceptible to catastrophic epidemic mortality. Because the Black Death did not arrive in a healthy country. It arrived in a country that had been suffering for 30 years, and the nature of that suffering tells us something important about the conditions under which catastrophic epidemics become possible. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is one of the most devastating events in English medieval history, and it is also one of the most poorly understood in terms of its causes. The standard explanation is climate-driven crop failure, and that is accurate as far as it goes. A series of cold, wet summers in the second decade of the 14th century produced repeated harvest failures across northern Europe, leading to food shortages that killed between 10 and 25% of the European population over 7 years. In England, the situation was particularly severe in the northern counties, where the combination of poor soil, harsh climate, and the additional burden of Scottish raids in the border counties created conditions of near total social collapse. But the climate explanation, while real, conceals a more complex story. The English agricultural economy in 1315 was already under enormous stress from factors that had nothing to do with the weather. The population of England had been growing since the Norman conquest, roughly tripling between 1066 and 1300, and by the early 14th century it had reached somewhere between 4 and 6 million people, which was close to or possibly beyond the carrying capacity of the medieval agricultural system. The available farmland had been so thoroughly put under the plough that marginal land that produced reasonable yields in good years but failed catastrophically in bad ones, was being farmed extensively. The intensification of land use had reduced fallow periods, depleted soil fertility, and reduced the resilience of the agricultural system to any significant perturbation. When the cold and wet years hit beginning in 1315, they hit a system with almost no slack, no reserves, no buffer against failure. The harvests didn't just fail, they failed completely, year after year, in a cascade of agricultural disaster that the institutional structures of medieval England were completely unprepared to manage. The church had granaries. The great lords had granaries. But the distribution mechanisms to get food from where it existed to where it was needed were rudimentary, and in practice, the institutional response was inadequate to prevent widespread starvation. The bodies that were buried in English churchyards in the 1310s and 1320s, the bodies of the famine dead, were the bodies of the most nutritionally vulnerable members of the population, the poorest, the youngest, the oldest, the already sick. But the survivors were not unaffected. A child who survived the famine years had done so at a cost. Malnutrition during the critical years of immune system development leaves lasting damage. The thymus, the organ in which T cells mature, is particularly sensitive to nutritional deficiency, and impaired thymic development in childhood produces lifelong reduction in immune competence. The children who survived the Great Famine and grew to adulthood were the young adults of 1348, and they were adults whose immune systems had been permanently compromised by their early experiences. This is not speculation. Paleopathological analysis of 14th century English skeletal remains has documented the physiological signatures of childhood malnutrition, including enamel hypoplasia in teeth, growth arrest lines in long bones, and markers of chronic nutritional deficiency at rates that confirm the profound and lasting physical impact of the famine years. The people who died in 1348 were not, in an immunological sense, the same people who would have died if the famine had never happened. They were weaker, more vulnerable, their immune systems already fighting a losing battle against the chronic diseases and nutritional deficiencies of a post-famine world. And then there are the animals. Henry Knighton's observation about livestock dying before the human plague began is one of the most intriguing and most neglected details in the entire Black Death record. He is not alone in noting it. Multiple 14th century sources from England and continental Europe describe a widespread and catastrophic murrain, an epidemic livestock disease preceding the human plague by months or in some accounts by years. The animals affected were primarily sheep and cattle, and the mortality rates described are staggering. Whole herds dying, entire manorial economies losing their livestock base within weeks. The standard historical response to this is to note that sheep murrain was a known and recurring problem in medieval England, that the early 14th century had seen several major livestock epidemics, and that the connection to the human Black Death is probably coincidental, or at most reflects the same environmental conditions that made both livestock and human populations vulnerable. That's possible, but it is also possible that the livestock deaths were an early indicator of the same pathogen that would later kill humans, or of a related pathogen that could infect both livestock and humans in the manner of some zoonotic viral hemorrhagic fevers. Some hemorrhagic fever viruses do infect multiple mammalian species. Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, for example, infects a wide range of domestic and wild animals as well as humans. Hantaviruses have rodent reservoirs, but can cause severe human disease through indirect contact. Ebola virus has caused die-offs in great ape populations alongside human outbreaks. The idea that a novel pathogen arriving in England in the mid-14th century might have infected livestock as well as humans is not biologically absurd. It is entirely consistent with what we know about the range of host species that some RNA viruses can infect. The murrain evidence has never been properly integrated into the epidemiological debate about the Black Death, because the mainstream model of bubonic plague has no room for it. Yersinia pestis does not infect sheep or cattle at rates that would produce the livestock epidemics described in the 14th century. If the disease described by Knighton and other chroniclers as preceding the human plague was causally related to the human Black Death, that causal relationship points strongly away from classical bubonic plague and towards something with a broader mammalian host range. Let's now look at the geography of survival within England in more detail, because the pattern of who lived and where they lived is one of the most under-examined aspects of the entire event. The mortality data from 1348 to 1350, drawn from episcopal registers, manorial records, and wills probate records, shows an uneven geographic distribution that is genuinely puzzling under the standard transmission model. The highest documented mortality rates in England cluster in three main geographic zones. The first is the southwest, particularly Devon, Somerset, and Dorset, which were the areas of first entry and saw some of the highest early mortality. The second is East Anglia, particularly Norfolk and Suffolk, which had high mortality that arrived somewhat later but was extremely severe. The third is parts of the East Midlands, particularly Lincolnshire and parts of Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire. These zones do not form a simple, expanding circle from the Dorset entry point, which is what you would expect from a disease spreading through person to person or flea-based transmission from a single origin. They are geographically separated, connected by trade routes, but not by the kind of continuous population contact that would be needed to sustain a flea-borne disease front-moving at the speed documented in the records. The areas of somewhat lower mortality, at least in the early phases, include the far north, particularly Northumberland and Cumberland, Highland Wales, and interestingly, certain urban areas in the Midlands, where population density might have been expected to accelerate spread, but instead seemed to produce higher survivor rates, possibly because urban populations had more prior exposure to a wider range of infectious diseases and consequently broader immune experience. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, Ralph of Shrewsbury, whose letter we discussed earlier, noted in his communications that some communities in his diocese were entirely destroyed, while neighbouring communities within the same parish saw much lower mortality, without any obvious explanation for the difference. He attributes this to divine will, the only framework available to him. Modern researchers attribute it to variation in local rat and flea populations, the dominant framework available to them. But the granularity of the variation, the fact that individual farms and hamlets might show wildly different mortality rates, while being separated by only a few hundred meters and sharing the same local rat population, suggests that something other than rodent density and flea prevalence was determining outcomes. Local genetic variation in the human population is one possibility. If CCR5 delta 32 and other protective immune variants were not uniformly distributed across the population, which is what you would expect from a mutation that was still at relatively low frequency before 1348, then small communities where the mutation happened to be overrepresented by chance would have survived at higher rates than neighboring communities where it happened to be underrepresented. This statistical noise in the genetic distribution of protective alleles could produce exactly the patchy, apparently random pattern of survival that contemporary observers noted with bewilderment. But there may be other explanations. Prior exposure is one. If the disease or a closely related pathogen had circulated at low levels in some communities, but not others before the major outbreak of 1348, communities with prior exposure might have had partial immunity that limited their mortality even in the face of the full epidemic wave. This is the principle behind herd immunity, and it can operate in complex and geographically uneven ways depending on local trade, movement, and social contact patterns. There is also the question of water. Medieval England's water supply was drawn primarily from wells, springs, streams, and rivers, and the quality of these water sources varied enormously by geography. Some researchers studying the Black Death have proposed that waterborne transmission, either of the pathogen itself or of secondary infections that made primary plague mortality worse, might have played a role in the geographic variation of outcomes. This is consistent with some 14th century accounts that describe the plague as associated with specific water sources. Though these accounts are also consistent with simple miasmatic theory, the contemporary belief that disease was caused by corrupted air or water, which makes it difficult to know whether the observations reflect genuine epidemiological insight or standard theoretical assumptions. The soil also varies. Specific soil types support different rodent populations, different insect populations, different plant communities, and different levels of microbial diversity. The areas of highest Black Death mortality in England map reasonably well onto the areas of most intensive medieval agriculture, which would correlate with the highest densities of the synanthropic rodents, rats and mice that live in close association with human settlements and their food stores, that are the classic plague reservoir. But they also map onto areas with specific soil and hydrological characteristics that might be relevant to viral reservoir maintenance in ways that have never been properly studied. The honest position, which very few researchers are willing to adopt explicitly, is that we don't know why some places in England in 1348 died at rates of 80 to 90%, while other places died at rates of 20 to 30%, and that the standard explanatory model, flea-rat human transmission from a bacterial pathogen, does not adequately account for this variation. The variation is real, documented, and unexplained. It is one of the central mysteries of the Black Death in England, and it is almost never discussed in popular accounts, precisely because acknowledging it requires acknowledging that the standard explanation is incomplete. Let's now turn to something that the standard histories treat as a footnote, but which is in fact one of the most remarkable stories in the entire Black Death narrative, the story of the Plague Saints, and what it reveals about the psychological and religious response to catastrophic epidemic mortality. When the Church of the 14th century was confronted with a disease it could not explain, treat, or prevent, it responded by mobilizing its existing theological and devotional resources, and chief among these was the cult of the saints. Saints, in medieval Catholic practice, were not merely historical figures of exemplary virtue. They were active intercessors, present in heaven, capable of pleading with God on behalf of their devotees, and specifically associated with particular domains of protection, including protection against specific diseases. The plague created enormous demand for saints with plague-specific protective powers, and the Church responded partly through the elevation of existing saints to plague protection roles and partly through the development of new cult centers around figures whose lives or deaths connected them to the disease. Saint Sebastian, a Roman martyr who, according to tradition, was shot full of arrows by order of the Emperor Diocletian, became the primary plague saint across most of Europe. The arrow-pierced body being interpreted as a visual analogy for the sudden penetration of the disease, the arrows as metaphors for the pestilential darts with which medieval medicine imagined the plague attacked the human body. The Sebastian cult expanded enormously in the aftermath of the Black Death, with new Sebastian chapel foundations, new iconographic programs showing the saint's arrow-pierced body, new votive practices dedicated to his intercession, appearing across England and the continent in the years after 1348. Saint Roch, a Franciscan tertiary from Montpellier, who according to his legend contracted the plague while nursing plague victims in Italy, showed the plague bubo on his own thigh, was miraculously cured, and subsequently died in a prison having been arrested on suspicion of being a spy, became the other major plague saint, particularly associated with Northern Europe. The Saint Roch cult developed slightly later than Saint Sebastian's, gaining major momentum in the late 14th and especially the 15th century. But its emphasis on active service to the plague sick, on physical contact with the diseased, on the saint's own bodily suffering from the plague, gave it a specifically hemorrhagic and physical character that resonated with the visceral reality of the disease in ways that the more abstract Sebastian cult did not. What is interesting about both saints, from the perspective of understanding the Black Death's psychological impact, is the way in which they encode specific emotional and theological responses to the epidemic. Sebastian speaks to the experience of sudden, unpredictable, violent death, the sense that the plague fell on its victims like a volley of arrows, choosing randomly, striking without warning. Roch speaks to the experience of caring for the dying and the fear of contagion, the moral dilemma of whether to flee the sick or remain to care for them, the possibility that self-sacrifice might earn divine protection or at least divine recognition. These are not abstract theological concerns. They are the specific existential questions that survivors of the Black Death faced every day. Questions about randomness and meaning, about obligation and self-preservation, about whether God was paying attention, and if so, what he thought he was doing. The Plague Saints gave those questions a ritual framework, a set of devotional practices that channeled the anxiety and grief and moral confusion of survival into forms that were socially manageable and institutionally containable. The expansion of pilgrimage in the aftermath of the Black Death is one of the clearest expressions of this psychological dynamic. People who had survived the plague, who were living with the guilt of survival, with the grief of loss, with the unresolved theological questions that the plague had raised, poured into the great pilgrimage routes with a fervour that made the post-plague period one of the most intense in the history of English religious practice. Canterbury, Walsingham, Bury St Edmunds, the major English pilgrimage centres, all saw a dramatic increase in visitor numbers and votive offerings in the decades after 1348. Not a decrease, which is what you might expect if the plague had damaged religious faith, but an increase, driven by the desperate human need to do something, anything, in the face of an event that had been completely beyond human control. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 1380s and 1390s, is set on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. And while Chaucer's treatment of the pilgrimage is famously ironic and secular in tone, the pilgrimage is the background fact of the work, the social reality that brings together the extraordinarily diverse group of characters whose voices make the tales. The pilgrimage culture that Chaucer depicts with such precise social observation is a specifically post-plague culture, the culture of a society that has been through something it cannot fully process, reaching toward ritual and community as ways of making sense of a world that had been comprehensively disrupted. The Black Death also transformed the physical landscape of English religious life in ways that are still visible. The Chantry Chapel movement, in which wealthy survivors endowed perpetual masses to be said for the souls of the dead, expanded enormously in the post-plague period. Before 1348, chantry foundations were rare and expensive. After 1348, they multiplied, as survivors who had watched entire families die created institutional mechanisms to ensure that prayers continued to be said for the dead in perpetuity. The theological framework of purgatory, the belief that the souls of the dead who were not entirely saintly, but not entirely damned, could be assisted toward heaven by the prayers and masses of the living, became the central preoccupation of English religious practice for the century. Following the plague, every church in England accumulated chantry chapels, chantry altars, mass foundations, obit payments, in a vast proliferation of perpetual memorial practice that transformed the interior space of English churches into dense landscapes of commemoration. The dead of 1348 were not allowed to simply be dead. They were kept present in institutional memory through the mechanism of endowed prayer, their names read out at masses, funded by their own wills, their souls perpetually supported by the prayers of priests who had no other function than remembering them. This is psychologically profound. The chantry movement is one of the clearest expressions in any culture of the specific grief of mass death, of the survivor's need to maintain connection with the departed, to refuse the full reality of loss, to insist that the dead are still present even if transformed. And the scale of the chantry movement after the Black Death, its permeation of every level of English society from the great royal foundations to the modest parish chantries endowed by small merchants and yeoman farmers, tells us something about the depth of the wound that the plague left in the English psyche. When Henry VIII dissolved the chantries in the 1540s, as part of the Protestant Reformation's attack on the theology of purgatory, he was destroying more than property. He was dismantling 2 centuries of accumulated grief work, the institutional mechanisms through which post-plague England had been managing its relationship with its dead. The violence of the Reformation, the specific emotional intensity of English Protestantism's rejection of the old religion, cannot be entirely understood without recognizing what the old religion had meant to people in the 2 centuries between the Black Death and the Reformation, and what the dissolution of its structures represented in terms of loss. The medieval English religious landscape was saturated with the presence of the dead. The dead were in the chantry chapels, in the mass foundations, in the prayers of the living, in the architecture of the churches. They were not gone. They were maintained, kept present, tended. The Reformation said, in effect, that this was superstition, that the dead did not need prayers, that the relationship between the living and the dead was theologically misconceived. For a population that had learned, in the specific crucible of the Black Death, to manage overwhelming loss through the specific mechanism of perpetual commemoration, that was an act of extraordinary violence, whatever its theological merits. Now let's consider the longer trajectory of epidemic mortality in England after the Black Death, because the story does not end in 1349, and the pattern of what happened in subsequent centuries tells us something important about the nature of the original event and its long-term biological legacy. The plague returned to England in 1361, 1368, 1374, 1382, and in numerous subsequent waves through the 14th and 15th centuries. Each wave was less catastrophic than the first, but each left its mark on the demography, the economy, the culture, and the psychology of the country. The total population of England, which had been somewhere between 4 and 6 million in 1300, fell to perhaps 2.5 to 3 million by the end of the 14th century and did not begin to recover significantly until the mid-15th century. It did not reach pre-plague levels until the 16th century. This means that England spent roughly 2 centuries in a state of demographic depression, with all the economic and social consequences that implies. The demographic recovery, when it eventually came, was shaped by the genetic legacy of the Black Death. The population that grew to fill the empty landscape of 15th and 16th century England was the genetic descendant of the Black Death survivors, carrying at higher frequency the immune variants that had protected their ancestors. This population showed different patterns of disease susceptibility than the pre-plague population, and the differences were not only quantitative but qualitative. They were more resistant to some diseases. They were, paradoxically, vulnerable to others. And the specific disease landscape of Tudor England, the health challenges that the Elizabethans and their predecessors faced, reflected both the biological legacy of the plague, survival selection, and the changing pathogen environment of an increasingly connected European and Atlantic world. The Tudor period saw the introduction to England of several new diseases, most dramatically syphilis, which appeared in Europe following the return of Columbus's sailors from the Americas in the 1490s, and the sweating sickness, whose English specificity has already been discussed. The response of the Tudor immune system to these new pathogens was shaped by the inheritance of 2 centuries of epidemic selection. This is not something that can be traced precisely with current technology, but the general principle that populations carry immune histories that reflect their epidemic histories is well established in immunological genetics. The English experience of the Black Death also left its mark on the country's medical tradition. The failure of Galenic medicine to prevent or treat the plague did not immediately destroy medical authority, but it created a long-term pressure toward empirical observation and experiment that contributed to the development of a more evidence-based approach to medicine in England over the following centuries. The English physician, John of Gaddesden, who claimed to have successfully treated the plague using specific remedies, was widely ridiculed by contemporaries who noted that his patients seemed to die just as often as anyone else's. But the scrutiny itself, the willingness to evaluate a physician's claims against outcomes, rather than simply accepting them on the basis of theoretical authority, represents a shift toward empirical thinking that is a specifically post-plague development. The anatomical tradition in English medicine, the direct observation of the human body through dissection rather than reliance on classical texts, accelerated in the post-plague period, partly because the scale of mortality created practical opportunities for anatomical study that had not previously existed, and partly because the failure of classical medicine to account for what was happening in bodies dying of plague created theoretical pressure to look more directly at the evidence. John Ardern, the English surgeon who wrote the most important medieval English surgical texts in the 1370s, trained in a medical environment shaped entirely by the aftermath of the plague, and his emphasis on direct clinical observation, on specific case descriptions, on outcomes measured against treatments, reflects a specifically post-plague empirical sensibility. The gradual development of English empirical science, which would eventually produce Francis Bacon's philosophy of induction, William Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood, and the founding of the Royal Society, has many complex causes. But the destruction of intellectual authority through the Black Death, the demonstrated failure of received theoretical frameworks to explain or address the catastrophe, is one of the deep roots from which the English empirical tradition grew. There is a kind of grim irony in all of this. The Black Death destroyed half of England. It also, by destroying confidence in authoritative knowledge, helped create the conditions for the development of a new kind of knowledge. The scientific revolution that changed the world in the 17th century had its intellectual roots in the late medieval questioning of authority that began, at least in part, with the catastrophic failure of medieval authority structures in 1348. The thread runs from the mass graves of East Smithfield to the Fellows of the Royal Society. It is not a straight thread, and many other things contributed to its weaving. But it is a real thread, and following it gives us a different, and in some ways more uncomfortable, understanding of where we came from and what the cost of our intellectual inheritance actually was. Now, let's consider the comparative perspective, because the Black Death was not only an English event, and placing the English experience in the wider context of the European and global pandemic reveals both the commonalities and the specific peculiarities of what happened in Britain. Continental Europe experienced the Black Death at roughly the same time and with roughly similar mortality rates, though with significant regional variation. Italy was one of the first and most severely affected regions, with Florence losing perhaps 60% of its population between 1348 and 1351. France was devastated. The Low Countries, Germany, Scandinavia, and Iberia all experienced catastrophic mortality. The Eastern Mediterranean saw the plague earlier than Western Europe, and the Byzantine Empire, already weakened by decades of political instability and economic decline, suffered mortality that contributed directly to its final collapse a century later. But there were also areas that appear to have been significantly less affected, at least in the initial wave. Poland experienced lower documented mortality than most of Western Europe, a fact that has attracted a great deal of speculation over the centuries, with explanations ranging from specific trade route geography that reduced exposure to distinctive dietary practices and food storage methods that reduced rat contact, to early and unusually effective containment measures undertaken by Polish rulers, to genetic population factors. None of these explanations is fully satisfying, and the Polish anomaly remains one of the curiosities of Black Death history. The Milan case is even more striking. Milan, one of the largest cities in medieval Europe, experienced significantly lower mortality in 1348 than Florence, Venice, or other major Italian cities. Contemporary accounts attribute this to the draconian quarantine measures imposed by Milan's ruling Visconti family, who walled up houses where plague appeared with the inhabitants inside, preventing escape and therefore spread. This measure was appalling in human terms, a literal sentence of death for everyone inside a plague-affected house, but appears to have been epidemiologically effective. The Milan case is cited as one of the earliest documented examples of quarantine measures successfully limiting epidemic spread, and it raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of public health emergency powers that have never been satisfactorily resolved. The contrast between Milan and Florence in 1348 is one of the most frequently cited examples in the history of public health, precisely because it demonstrates, or appears to demonstrate, that human decisions made at the institutional level can affect the outcome of epidemic mortality events. Florence, which did not impose comparable containment measures, lost perhaps 60% of its population. Milan, which did, lost significantly less, though the exact figures are disputed. The lesson that institutional response matters, that epidemic mortality is not purely a biological phenomenon, but has a significant human and political component, is one that the Black Death taught with brutal clarity. England in 1348 had nothing remotely comparable to the Visconti quarantine measures. The institutional response, such as it was, consisted primarily of prayer, procession, and the posthumous appointment of replacement clergy. There were no systematic attempts to identify and isolate infected communities, no port quarantine protocols, no organized medical response. The disease moved through the country largely unchecked, limited only by the natural geography of settlement patterns and the biological factors, genetic and immunological, that produced variation in individual and community susceptibility. The absence of institutional response reflects partly the genuine limitations of medieval epidemiological understanding, the lack of germ theory, the inability to identify transmission routes, the dominance of miasmatic theory that located disease causation in corrupted air rather than in specific pathogens. But it also reflects the political and institutional character of 14th century English governance, which had neither the centralized authority nor the administrative infrastructure to implement the kind of systematic quarantine measures that Milan's autocratic Visconti rulers could impose. Medieval English governance was, by continental standards, relatively decentralized and legally constrained. The tradition of common law, Magna Carta, the role of Parliament, the independence of the Church, all of these institutional features limited the ability of the English crown to exercise the kind of arbitrary personal authority that the Visconti exercised in Milan. These limitations on royal power are, in the long run of English history, part of the story of how England developed the constitutional traditions that eventually gave rise to parliamentary democracy and the rule of law. But in the short run of 1348, they meant that the English crown could not do what a more autocratic ruler might have done to limit the spread of the disease. There is something almost philosophically perverse about this. The very institutional features that make medieval England interesting from a constitutional and legal history perspective, the features that distinguish it from the more autocratic continental political tradition, are also the features that made it unable to mount an effective public health response to the Black Death. Liberty and epidemic vulnerability are not simply opposed, but they do create specific trade-offs that the history of 1348 exposes with unusual clarity. The Jewish communities of England had been expelled in 1290, 58 years before the Black Death arrived, by order of Edward III. This fact is relevant because across continental Europe, Jewish communities were subjected to horrific persecution in the wake of the Black Death, accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells, leading to massacres in cities, including Strasbourg, Basel, Frankfurt, and many others. England, having expelled its Jewish population, did not participate in this specific atrocity. This is not a point of pride. The 1290 expulsion was itself a crime of enormous proportions, destroying communities that had existed in England for 2 centuries. But the historical fact is that the anti-Jewish pogroms associated with the Black Death across continental Europe did not occur in England, because the population that would have been targeted was not present to be targeted. The continental anti-Jewish persecution associated with the Black Death is one of the most revealing aspects of the epidemic's social and psychological impact. The need to identify an agent of causation, to assign blame, to find a human explanation for what appeared to be an incomprehensible divine or natural catastrophe, expressed itself in the 14th century as it has expressed itself in response to epidemics throughout history by targeting the perceived outsider, the alien community, the group whose distinctive practices made them candidates for the role of deliberate contaminator. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells because they had distinctive hygiene practices, including ritual hand-washing and dietary restrictions, that may in some cases have given them marginally lower mortality rates than surrounding Christian communities. The lower mortality was observed and interpreted not as the outcome of practices that happened to reduce pathogen exposure, but as proof of non-exposure, of not having been affected by a disease that affected everyone around them. And the explanation that explained why they were not affected was deliberate avoidance, and the explanation that explained deliberate avoidance was prior knowledge, and the explanation that explained prior knowledge was causative agency. The logic, while completely false, is not entirely irrational, given the knowledge framework within which 14th century Europeans were operating. England's absence from this specific atrocity does not mean that the English response to the plague was free of scapegoating. Other groups served at the scapegoat function in the English context. The poor were blamed, as they are always blamed, their poverty interpreted as evidence of moral failure that invited divine punishment. Foreigners were suspected. Prostitutes and those deemed sexually immoral were considered to have brought divine wrath upon their communities. The ideology of blame in epidemic mortality is remarkably consistent across time and place, always lighting on the most vulnerable and most stigmatized members of the affected community, always serving the psychological function of transforming random horror into punishable deviance. The flagellant movement that spread across continental Europe in the wake of the plague did not establish itself in England with the same force as in Germany or the Low Countries, partly because the English church hierarchy was quicker than some continental hierarchies to condemn it, and partly because the specific religious and cultural conditions in England produced a somewhat different spiritual response to the epidemic. English spirituality in the post-plague period was more inward-looking, more focused on individual devotion and mystical experience than the dramatic public penitential theatre of the flagellants. The 14th century English mystical tradition, represented by writers including Richard Rolle, Walter Hilton, Julian of Norwich, and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, developed in this specific context of post-plague spiritual seeking and its emphasis on direct individual experience of the divine, on personal mystical union with God, rather than institutional mediation or collective ritual performance, reflects the specific spiritual landscape of a society that had been through something that institutional religion could not adequately contain. Julian of Norwich is worth dwelling on for a moment, because she is one of the most remarkable figures in the entire history of English religion, and her life and work are inseparable from the world that the Black Death made. Born approximately 1343, she lived through the arrival of the plague as a child of 5, through the subsequent waves of the epidemic in her childhood and adolescence, through the entire social transformation of post-plague England. In 1373, when she was approximately 30 years old, she fell severely ill and was expected to die. During her illness, she received a series of visions of Christ's suffering and of the divine love underlying all creation that she spent the rest of her long life reflecting on and writing about. Her revelations of divine love, completed in its longer form probably in the 1390s, is the first known book in English written by a woman, and it contains one of the most extraordinary responses to theodicy in the entire history of Christian thought. The central question that Julian wrestles with throughout the Revelations is exactly the question that the Black Death had forced upon her generation. If God is good and loving, why is there so much suffering and evil in the world? Her answer, developed over decades of contemplation, is not a theoretical resolution of the paradox, but an insistence on holding the contradiction, on maintaining simultaneously the reality of suffering and the reality of divine love without resolving either into the other. Her famous phrase, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," is not a denial of suffering. It is a refusal to let suffering have the final word. It is the statement of someone who has looked directly at the worst that reality offers, who grew up in a world shaped by mass death, who came close to dying herself, and who chose, after decades of reflection, to affirm a goodness underlying reality that is not negated by any amount of evidence to the contrary. It is, in this sense, the deepest possible theological response to the Black Death, and it is a response that could only have been written by someone formed in the specific spiritual crucible of post-plague England. Julian is barely discussed in mainstream histories of the Black Death. She appears, if at all, as a footnote in the cultural consequences section. But she is in many ways the most complete response to the question of what the Black Death meant that the English 14th century produced. The dead of 1348 were mourned, replaced, commemorated, economically adjusted for, theologically wrestled with, and finally, in Julian's extraordinary mind, held in a vision of divine love so comprehensive that not even mass death could fall outside it. That she existed and wrote and survived long enough to complete her work is itself a kind of statement about what the Black Death ultimately produced. Out of the worst thing that had ever happened to England came, among many other things, the first book in English written by a woman, and one of the most profound works of Christian mysticism in any language. The dead of 1348 would not have found that consolation. But we can note it and recognize it as part of the complex and irreducible legacy of what happened when something arrived on the southern coast of England in the summer of that terrible year. Now, let's address the question of memory, because the way the Black Death has been remembered and forgotten and misremembered over the centuries is itself a significant part of its historical legacy. The 14th century English chroniclers who recorded the plague were aware, in the acute and immediate way of personal witness, of the scale of what had happened. They wrote with a specificity, a directness, a sense of urgent testimony that reflects the knowledge that what they were seeing needed to be preserved, that future generations needed to know. Henry Knighton's account is specific about numbers, about geography, about economic consequences, about social disruption, because Knighton understood that he was recording something extraordinary. The anonymal chronicler writes about the plague's arrival and spread with the attention to detail of someone who knows that detail matters, that the specific timing and geographic pattern of events is not incidental but essential to understanding what happened. But memory fades. By the 15th century, a generation removed from the immediate crisis, the Black Death had begun to be absorbed into a more general narrative of divine punishment and providential history, in which the specific biological and epidemiological details became less important than the theological meaning. By the 16th century, the Reformation's disruption of the commemorative traditions that had maintained institutional memory of the dead, the dissolution of the chantries, the attack on prayers for the dead, the reform of the liturgical calendar, removed some of the specific mechanisms through which the plague dead had been kept present in English religious life. By the 17th century, the Black Death was increasingly a piece of historical knowledge rather than a living memory, cited for comparison in discussions of later epidemics, but no longer present as a shaping force in lived experience. The great plague outbreaks of the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly the devastating London Plague of 1665, which killed approximately 100,000 people in a single city in a single year, had their own immediate and overwhelming presence in public consciousness, and somewhat overshadowed the earlier and in some ways larger 14th century catastrophe in popular memory. The 1665 plague is the one that most educated English people knew about, the one associated with Samuel Pepys's diary, with the flight of the court, with the red crosses on doors and the carts of bodies, because it was documented in a rich and accessible literary and administrative record that the 14th century plague, lacking print culture and with a much sparser written record, could not match. The gradual reconstruction of the Black Death's scale and significance through modern historical and archaeological research is, in a sense, an act of recovery of lost memory. The mass graves excavated in London, in Bristol, in Lincoln, and elsewhere are physical testimony that had been buried and forgotten, lying under the modern city, waiting to be rediscovered. The documentary records in episcopal registers and manorial rolls, which survived in archives but were not widely read or analysed for centuries, are also a form of buried testimony, preserved but not accessed. The genetic evidence in the genomes of living European populations is perhaps the deepest form of buried memory, the plague's record written in the biological fabric of its survivors' descendants, invisible and unread until the development of the technology to sequence it. All of this archaeological, documentary, and genetic evidence is in the process of being reassembled into a more complete and more honest picture of what happened in England in 1348. The picture that is emerging is, as I have been arguing throughout this account, more complex, more uncertain, more biologically extraordinary than the standard narrative allows. It is a picture in which the identification of Yersinia pestis in the graves is a data point, but not a resolution, in which the CCR5 Delta 32 selection signature is a puzzle that points towards something viral, in which the speed and pattern of spread challenge the standard transmission model, in which the contemporary accounts of atmospheric phenomena and simultaneous appearance in multiple locations demand explanation rather than dismissal. The full truth of what happened in 1348 may never be recoverable with certainty. We are working from incomplete evidence, with imperfect tools, across 7 centuries of time. The pathogen or pathogens responsible may never be definitively identified in a way that closes the debate. The geographic and genetic factors that determined patterns of survival may never be fully disentangled. The atmospheric or environmental factors that contributed to the epidemic's emergence and spread may never be precisely characterized. But the pursuit of the truth, even incomplete and uncertain truth, is what we owe to the dead. They died without understanding why. They died without the comfort of a coherent explanation. They died in their hundreds of thousands, in their millions across Europe, without any framework that could make sense of what was happening. The least we can do, 7 centuries later, is acknowledge that our own explanation is incomplete, that the neat story of fleas and rats and a bacterium, named in 1894, does not fully account for what actually happened, and that the honest answer to the question of what arrived in Britain in 1348 is something extraordinary, something we still do not entirely understand, something that changed everything. The dead of 1348 are in the ground under English cities and fields. They are in the genomes of the living. They are in the language that we speak, and the literature that we read, and the institutions that we inhabit. They are, in all these ways, still present. Their story is not over. Our telling of it is incomplete. And that incompleteness, that open, unresolved, genuinely uncertain state of the historical and scientific question, is perhaps the most honest tribute we can pay to the scale and the strangeness of what they experienced. If something this catastrophic, this formative, biologically and historically significant, can still be incompletely understood after 7 centuries of inquiry, then the lesson is not that we should stop asking questions. The lesson is the opposite. The lesson is that the questions matter more than the comfortable certainty of a closed case, and that the dead deserve the discomfort of continued inquiry far more than they deserve the false resolution of a tidy explanation. Something arrived in Britain in 1348. We know that it was catastrophic. We know that it was fast. We know that it was selective in ways that left genetic traces still readable in living people. We know that contemporary observers described it in terms that do not map cleanly onto the standard model. We know that the standard model is incomplete. We do not know, with the certainty that the textbooks imply, what it actually was. That uncertainty is the truth. And the truth, even when uncertain, is what the dead deserve. Thank you for spending this time in the deep and strange history of 1348. If these kinds of stories are why you're here, if the places where history gets genuinely complicated and the explanations stop being sufficient are the places that interest you most, then subscribe and let's keep going. There are so many more of these rooms in the past, so many more doors that open onto questions that haven't been answered yet. Drop a comment and let me know where you are, what time it is there, what brought you to this particular corner of a very strange history tonight. And if you drifted off somewhere in the middle, that's all right too. The questions will still be here when you wake up. They've been here for 700 years. They can wait a little longer. There is one more thread in this story that deserves to be followed, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable of all, because it connects the medieval catastrophe of 1348 to patterns in British history that extend well beyond the medieval period and raise questions about the island's specific and peculiar relationship with epidemic catastrophe across centuries. England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland have collectively been the sites of a disproportionate number of major epidemic events in the recorded history of the North Atlantic world. The 6th century pandemics, the Black Death, the sweating sickness, the repeated plague outbreaks of the 16th and 17th centuries, the catastrophic Irish typhus and famine of the 1840s, the early and severe impact of the 1918 influenza pandemic in certain British populations, the specific geographic, environmental, and demographic characteristics of the British Isles seem to have created conditions, repeatedly across many centuries, in which epidemic mortality events have been particularly severe. This is not an argument for British genetic inferiority or for any other kind of essentialist determinism. It is an observation about the interaction between specific geographic and environmental conditions and specific epidemic dynamics, an observation that suggests the British experience of the Black Death was not simply an instance of a uniform European-wide catastrophe, but was shaped by specifically British conditions that amplified the mortality and altered the transmission dynamics in ways that are still not fully understood. The British Isles sit at a specific geographic position in the North Atlantic that makes them a natural convergence point for populations and pathogens moving along the Atlantic seaboard from multiple directions. They have a specific climate, maritime and mild, that maintains year-round conditions favorable for a wider range of pathogen transmission than the more extreme continental climates. They have historically had dense populations relative to their land area, creating the human density that favors efficient pathogen transmission. And they have historically been a major node in global trade networks, receiving ships and sailors and goods from across the known world with all the epidemiological exposure that entails. These structural factors do not change the fundamental biology of the Black Death. They do help explain why the British experience may have been at the severe end of the European distribution and why the island continues, across many centuries and many epidemics, to appear in the historical record as a place where epidemic mortality events have had an outsized impact relative to population size. The lesson of this broader pattern is the same as the lesson of 1348 itself. Epidemic mortality is not purely a biological phenomenon. It is the product of a complex interaction between pathogen biology, host vulnerability, environmental conditions, population density and structure, trade and movement patterns, institutional capacity, and the accumulated genetic legacies of previous epidemic events. Understanding any single epidemic event requires attending to all of these dimensions, not just the pathogen in the grave. The Black Death in Britain was the product of a specific convergence of factors, some biological, some environmental, some social, some historical, that produced an outcome of extraordinary severity. Disentangling those factors, understanding their relative contributions, and drawing the lessons that the event offers about epidemic vulnerability and resilience is work that is still very much in progress. The evidence is still being gathered, the models are still being tested, the questions are still open. What is not open is the scale of the loss. Between a third and a half of England died in 18 months. They were real people, with real lives, real families, real communities, real futures that were cut short. They deserve to be remembered not as demographic statistics, but as what they were. Human beings overtaken by something they could not understand or prevent, whose deaths shaped the world that their descendants, all of us, have inherited. The fields they left unploughed are still fields. The churches they left half-built are still standing, some of them, with their unfinished walls and their truncated towers, testifying silently to the moment when the masons put down their tools and did not come back. The names in the episcopal registers, Thomas the priest, John the rector, William the vicar, listed under the heading of those who died in the pestilence and needed to be replaced, are still there in the archives, waiting to be read by anyone willing to sit with the specific and individual weight of what they represent. Something arrived in Britain in 1348. We are still living in the world it made. And now, as this long night of history comes toward its rest, think for a moment about where you are, about the walls around you, the city, or the countryside beyond, the particular configuration of language and culture and institution that you inhabit. All of it is downstream of 1348 in ways you cannot fully trace, but that run through everything nonetheless. The language you think in, the religious tradition that shaped the moral assumptions you carry, whether you practice that religion or not, the constitutional and legal frameworks that structure your social world, the genetic inheritance you carry in your own cells. The dead of the Black Death did not die for any of this. They did not die so that English literature could exist, or so that the Reformation could happen, or so that CCR5 Delta 32 could reach a higher frequency in the English genome. They died because something catastrophic arrived and killed them, without meaning, without purpose, without any larger design that they could see or that we can definitively identify. But their deaths had consequences, enormous and lasting consequences that ran forward through the centuries in ways that are still unfolding. Every generation inherits a world shaped by catastrophes it did not experience. Every generation lives with the genetic and cultural and institutional legacies of events that happened before it was born. The Black Death is simply the most dramatic and most traceable of those formative catastrophes in the specific case of England, the event whose fingerprints are most visible in the historical record and in the contemporary genome, the event whose consequences were so large and so pervasive that they can be followed through literature and economics and religion and language and genetics across 7 centuries of subsequent history. Understanding it more fully, pushing past the tidy textbook explanation toward the genuinely uncertain and genuinely complex truth, is not merely an academic exercise. It is part of the broader project of understanding what we are, where we came from, and what the accumulated weight of human history means for the world we are making now. The questions that the Black Death raises about epidemic vulnerability, about institutional response, about the interaction of environmental stress and human biology, about the social and psychological consequences of catastrophic mass mortality, are not merely historical questions. They are questions with direct contemporary relevance that the events of the last few years have made impossible to ignore. History does not repeat itself, but it does, as the saying goes, rhyme, and the specific rhyme patterns, the structural similarities between the conditions that made 1348 so catastrophic and the conditions of the contemporary world are worth attending to carefully, not to predict, but to understand, not to despair, but to be honest about the scale of what human societies have survived before, about the depth of the adaptive capacity that our species has demonstrated across every catastrophe in its long and improbable history. The survivors of 1348 rebuilt, imperfectly, incompletely, with grief and confusion and moral compromise, but they rebuilt, and the world they built, however shaped by loss and violence and the arbitrary cruelty of a catastrophe they could not fully understand, was a world in which human life continued, in which culture persisted, in which the capacity for meaning-making and community and art and inquiry endured. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, an extraordinary thing, and it is what the dead of 1348, who had no idea that they were shaping the future, no idea that their deaths would echo through centuries of history, no idea that their genes would be readable in living people 700 years later, left us. Not a lesson, exactly, not a message. Just the fact of their survival, passed forward through every generation since, down to the specific people alive in the world tonight, reading this in the dark, carrying the legacy of 1348 in their bodies and their culture and their language, mostly without knowing it, but carrying it nonetheless. Rest now. The questions will still be here in the morning. They have been here for 700 years. They are patient questions. They can wait. There is a village in Derbyshire that most people have never heard of, and yet its story is one of the most remarkable in the entire history of epidemic mortality. Not from 1348, but from the 17th century, and it serves as a kind of postscript to everything we have been discussing, a demonstration that the questions raised by the Black Death echo forward through time in ways that continue to produce new and extraordinary evidence. The village of Ayam in the Peak District is famous among epidemiologists and historians for what happened there in 1665 and 1666, when the plague arrived, apparently via a bundle of infected cloth from London, and the village, under the leadership of its rector William Mompesson, chose to quarantine itself voluntarily to prevent the escape of infected villagers that might spread the disease to surrounding communities. The Ayam quarantine lasted 14 months. 259 of the village's approximately 350 inhabitants died. The survival of the remaining roughly 90 is attributed to the quarantine itself, to divine mercy, depending on who you ask, and to something else that only became apparent centuries later. In the 1990s, a researcher named Stephen O'Brien noticed that a remarkable number of Ayam's documented descendants, the families who could trace their ancestry back to the 1665 to 1666 plague survivors, carried the CCR5 delta 32 mutation at unusually high frequency. When O'Brien and his colleagues tested descendants of Ayam survivors, they found CCR5 delta 32 at frequencies significantly above the general English average, which was already elevated by the Black Death selection effect. The implication was that the plague of 1666 in Ayam had applied another round of selection pressure on the same genetic variant, further increasing its frequency in the survivor population. But here is the strange part. The 1665 to 1666 plague in Ayam was, by all conventional understanding, bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis. This is the same disease for which CCR5 delta 32 should not provide protection, because Yersinia pestis does not use the CCR5 receptor. And yet, the genetic evidence from Ayam replicated in multiple subsequent studies with larger sample sizes, strongly suggests that CCR5 Delta 32 conferred survival advantage in IAM in 1665 to 1666, just as it appears to have done in England in 1348. O'Brien's interpretation was cautious. He suggested that CCR5 Delta 32 might provide protection against septicemic complications of bubonic plague through an indirect immune mechanism not yet characterized. That's possible, but the alternative interpretation, that the IAM plague was not purely bubonic plague, that it involved a viral co-infecting agent against which CCR5 Delta 32 did provide direct protection, is consistent with the evidence and has never been definitively ruled out. The 1665 to 1666 Great Plague of London and its contemporaneous outbreaks in English provincial towns and villages has traditionally been classified as the same disease that caused the Black Death, the same Yersinia pestis, the same flea-rat human transmission chain, just 3 centuries later, and the DNA evidence supports the identification of Yersinia pestis. But the AM genetic data, like the broader Black Death genetic data, raises the possibility that the story is more complex, that viral co-infection or viral contribution was present in multiple waves of the British plague epidemics, and that CCR5 Delta 32 was selected for repeatedly because the epidemics repeatedly included a viral component against which it provided protection. This is speculative. It may be wrong, but it is a coherent hypothesis that fits the evidence better than the purely bacterial model, and it connects the Black Death of 1348, the sweating sickness of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, and the later plague outbreaks of the 17th century into a single narrative about the specific epidemic history of Britain and the specific genetic legacy of that history in the contemporary English population. The people of Ayam, who voluntarily quarantined themselves and died in their hundreds, deserve to be remembered for the extraordinary moral courage that their decision represented. They were not sophisticated people in any educational or social sense. They were rural English villagers in the 17th century, with limited education, limited understanding of the disease they were facing, and limited reason to believe that their sacrifice would benefit anyone beyond their immediate neighbours. They died so that other people would not be infected, and some of them, the ones who survived, passed on their genes to descendants who can be found today, carrying in their cells the double legacy of the Black Death selection and the IAM selection, the specific genetic heritage of 2 rounds of brutal epidemic filtering in the same population over 3 centuries. The AYAM story has become a symbol in English culture of community courage, of collective self-sacrifice, of the willingness to bear private cost for public benefit. It is taught in schools. It is commemorated by annual plague services in the village. It is one of those rare historical events that seems to crystallize something fundamental about human moral capacity, the ability to choose, under conditions of extreme personal danger, to act for others rather than for oneself. But the Ayayam story is also, in its genetic legacy, a story about the deep biological consequences of epidemic events, about how the choices made by a handful of people in a small English village in 1665 are still readable in the DNA of their descendants today. The moral choice and the biological consequence are inseparable. The people who stayed and died selected, unwillingly and without knowledge, for the genetic variants that protected the people who stayed and survived. The village's moral heroism and its evolutionary biology are the same event, seen from different angles. That is not to reduce the moral heroism to mere genetics. The courage is real, it is human, it is irreducible to any biological explanation. But the convergence of the moral story and the biological story at the specific point of that small Derbyshire village in 1665 is one of the most remarkable instances in all of history of the way in which human choices and biological processes interact to shape the world we inherit. From the mass graves of the Black Death in 1348 to the plague survivors of Ayam in 1666, England's epidemic history is written in the genomes of its living people with a specificity and a continuity that we are only now beginning to read. Every human being carries, in their DNA, the legacy of the catastrophes that shaped the populations they descended from. The specific configuration of immune genes that you carry is a record of every epidemic that killed your ancestors' contemporaries and left your ancestors alive. You are the result of uncountable cycles of selection, an accumulation of survivals stretching back through every plague and famine and catastrophe in the long human past. The Black Death is simply the most visible, the most dramatic, the most historically documented of those selection events in the specific case of England. It is the catastrophe whose genetic fingerprints are clearest, whose historical record is most detailed, whose cultural consequences are most traceable. But it is not unique in kind. It is one event in a long series of events, each of which selected for survival and against vulnerability, each of which left its mark in the genetic archive of the surviving population. We are, all of us, the product of catastrophe. Not in a despairing sense, not in a sense that negates the value of the lives that catastrophe made possible, but in the simple factual sense that the specific genetic and cultural inheritance we carry is the product of selection events that killed enormous numbers of people and left the survivors to produce the lineages that eventually produced us. The dead outnumber us unimaginably. For every person alive today, there are uncountable ancestors who died before they could contribute to the lineage, who were victims of the epidemics and famines and disasters that selected for the specific configuration of traits that was ancestral to us. That is a profound and humbling thought. We are not the inevitable product of an ascending arc of human progress. We are the contingent product of a series of catastrophes, the accidental survivors of events that could have gone differently and would have produced very different descendants if they had. The England that exists today, the English language and culture and institutions and people, is the product of a specific and in some ways arbitrary sequence of selection events, of which the Black Death is the most dramatic and consequential. The alternative England, the England that might have existed if the Black Death had not arrived in 1348, is unimaginable. We cannot construct it. We cannot know what English literature would have looked like if Chaucer's world had not been shaped by the specific social and cultural disruptions of the post-plague period. We cannot know what the English Reformation would have looked like if the Black Death had not eroded the institutional authority of the medieval church. We cannot know what the genetic profile of the contemporary English population would look like if the extreme selection event of 1348 had not elevated the frequency of CCR5 delta 32 and other immune variants. We can only know the England that actually exists, shaped by the specific catastrophe that actually happened, carrying the specific genetic and cultural legacy of the specific survival that actually occurred. That England is what it is, and what it is includes the extraordinary richness and complexity that comes from a culture formed by crisis, tested by catastrophe, repeatedly disrupted and repeatedly rebuilt, each rebuilding incorporating the lessons and the legacies and the losses of what came before. The dead of 1348 are in this England. They are in its language and its literature and its theology and its politics and its genetics. They are not gone. They were transformed, dispersed, absorbed into the fabric of everything that came after, everything that still exists, everything that continues. Something arrived in Britain in 1348, and it never entirely left. Let's end where we began, which is with the question of what we were taught versus what the evidence actually shows. Because that gap between the comforting authority of the textbook and the genuinely uncertain, genuinely strange reality of the historical and scientific evidence is not just a feature of the Black Death story. It is a feature of how we tell history generally, how we construct narratives that are clean enough to be teachable and simple enough to be remembered, at the cost of the complexity and the uncertainty that the honest evidence actually contains. The Black Death in Britain was not simply the bubonic plague, spread by fleas on rats, killing perhaps a third of the population in a tragic but explicable epidemic. That story is not false, exactly. The elements are present. Yersinia pestis is in the graves. Rats and fleas were certainly part of the transmission network. A third to a half of the population did die. But the story is radically incomplete. in ways that matter, ways that point toward a more complex, more mysterious, more biologically extraordinary reality that the tidy textbook account systematically excludes. The speed of spread exceeds anything classical bubonic plague produces. The mortality rates in specific communities exceed anything classical bubonic plague produces. The winter transmission defies the expected seasonal pattern. The simultaneous appearance in geographically separated locations defies the single entry point origin story. The genetic selection signature points toward viral rather than bacterial causation. The contemporary accounts describe atmospheric and environmental phenomena that the standard model ignores. The pattern of survival, both individual and community level, shows variation that the flea-rat-human model cannot fully explain. None of this means the standard model is entirely wrong. It means it is incomplete. It means there is more to the story than the story we have been telling. And the pursuit of that more, the willingness to sit with the discomfort of genuine uncertainty rather than the false comfort of premature closure, is what serious engagement with this history requires. The people who died in 1348 deserve that engagement. The living who carry their genetic legacy deserve it. The history that was shaped by their deaths deserves it. And the present, which is always downstream of the past in ways that are only partially visible, deserves the most honest account of its origins that we can produce. What arrived in Britain in 1348 was extraordinary. We still do not entirely know what it was. That uncertainty is not a failure of knowledge, it is the truth. The question of what England lost in 1348 is one that historians have wrestled with in terms of population and institutions and culture and economy. But there is a deeper and less tractable version of that question, which is what intellectual and creative potential was lost. How many people who would have made discoveries, written books, developed ideas, contributed to the cultural and intellectual heritage of the country died before they could do any of those things? We will never know. The potential is as invisible as the individuals themselves, as absent from the record as the thoughts that went unexpressed, because the minds that would have expressed them were in the ground at East Smithfield, or in the fields of Lincolnshire, or in the plague pits of the northern cities. The cultural flowering of late 14th century England, the work of Chaucer and Langland and Julian and Gower and the Pearl poet and all the other voices of that extraordinary literary generation, represents one version of what post-plague England produced. It is the version we can read and study and admire. But behind it, invisible and unrecoverable, is the version that never happened. The works that were never written because their authors died in 1348, at ages that never allowed them to develop their gifts. The England that survived the Black Death produced a remarkable cultural flowering. The England that existed in 1347 would have produced something different, something we will never know, something lost with every individual who died before they could contribute. This is not merely a poignant reflection, it is a substantive observation about the way catastrophic mortality events reshape the cultural as well as the biological landscape of the populations they hit. Natural selection, in a biological sense, selects for genetic traits that enhance survival and reproduction. But epidemic mortality also selects, in a more diffuse and less precise way, for cultural and intellectual traits. The people who survive an epidemic are not a random sample of the pre-epidemic population in cultural terms any more than they are in genetic terms. They are disproportionately the people who happen to live where they lived, work at what they worked at, interact with whom they interacted with, in ways that reduced their exposure or enhanced their resistance. And the culture they produce after the epidemic reflects their specific experiences, their specific survivals, their specific losses. The dark, morally complex, skeptical, sardonic culture of late 14th century English literature is not accidental. It is the cultural product of a specific set of survivors. People who had watched half of their world die, people who had questioned the institutions that had failed them, people who had asked the unanswerable questions about why the good and the innocent died alongside the wicked and the corrupt, people who had learned from direct and overwhelming experience that authority is not self-validating, that tradition is not self-evidently true, that the world does not conform to the frameworks we build to explain it. That specific cultural character, skeptical and empirical and morally complex, is one of the most persistent features of the English intellectual tradition. It runs through Chaucer's irony and Langland's social critique, and Julian's theodicy, and forward through Shakespeare's ambiguity, and Milton's wrestling with authority, and Newton's empiricism, and Darwin's painstaking attention to inconvenient evidence, and forward, still into the contemporary English intellectual character. It is a recognizable thread, and its origins are multiple and complex. But one of its deep roots is in the specific experience of 1348, in the specific cultural formation of people who had lived through something that broke the old certainties and demanded new ways of making sense of the world. That is the final legacy of the Black Death in Britain that I want to name, because it is the one that is most easily missed in the epidemiological and demographic and economic analyses. The Black Death did not only kill people and reshape populations and alter institutions and transform economies. It also changed how people thought. It changed what questions they asked and what answers they found plausible. It created a specific intellectual and spiritual landscape in which certain kinds of thinking became possible and necessary that had not been equally possible or necessary before. And from that landscape grew a culture that is, in some of its deepest characteristics, the direct descendant of the catastrophe of 1348. We are thinking in ways partly shaped by how the survivors of the Black Death thought. We are asking questions partly because the Black Death taught their ancestors that certain questions had to be asked. We are carrying, in our intellectual as well as our genetic inheritance, the specific legacy of what arrived in Britain in 1348 and what it left behind when it finally, after 2 centuries of recurrent waves, ceased to be the dominant shaping force in English life. That is the true long-form history of the Black Death in Britain. Not just what happened in 1348 and 1349, but what those events set in motion across the next 2 centuries of English history, and how those 2 centuries shaped the country and the culture and the intellectual tradition that produced everything that came after. The thread runs from the plague ships of 1348 to the language you are reading in, right now, tonight. Something arrived in Britain in 1348. We are still living with everything it started. The buried dead still speak, if we are willing to listen to them properly. Not through mysticism, not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the specific and material traces they left behind in the earth, in the archives, in the genomes of their descendants. 7 centuries on, we are still learning to read those traces, still developing the tools and the methods and the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads away from the comfortable and the tidy and the already explained. That willingness, that commitment to honest uncertainty in the face of genuinely complex evidence, is itself part of the legacy of 1348. It is part of what the catastrophe taught and what the survivors and their descendants slowly, painfully, across centuries of intellectual history, learned to put into practice. The questions remain. They are good questions. They are worth keeping.